Humanity won the war, and there's our warrior, completely exhausted in the middle of the rebel. The 6 evil gods who wanted to destroy the entire world were completely defeated by the team. All of them were gone, and even the last giant sea monster took a nasty fall in front of everyone. But this victory came at a great cost, and the final boss's body falls lifeless to the ground. Nearly the entire planet was covered by a deadly sea, and now everyone faces their own end. Our hero gives a frustrated smile, lamenting how everything was left in ruins. He wonders why it feels like they lost, even after winning the final battle, with the main tower that held the land together collapsing. Not even the survivors would make it. The sea waters keep rising endlessly, threatening to cover the last patches of land. The young man complains that the cursed sea didn't vanish, and a voice says he's just talking to himself. The guy in red points out that talking like that makes it sound like he did everything alone. The silver-haired girl joins the conversation and accuses her friend of pretending he was in bad shape earlier. The third ally lets out an exhausted sigh and says their leader just wanted to take advantage of the situation. As the last blacksmith, the guy, reminds them that they all would have been done for without his weapons. The whole group gets annoyed by his response, finding the weapon maker's arrogance absurd. He tells the 3 to be quiet and says if they're so upset, they should just give everything back. These warriors never chose a side in the war and always did things for themselves. The silver-haired fighter was only in it for the rewards and smashed everything in her way. The ice user was also just looking out for himself during the tensest moments of the battle. But despite being so selfish, these 3 were the ones who helped defeat the enemy the most. The blacksmith wonders if the outcome would have been different if they'd just arrived a little sooner. Sitting on the ground, our hero asks if any of them have a chance of making it out of there alive. The warrior in red falls to his knees and says that his internal injuries are very serious. The other 2 reveal critical injuries, noticing the cursed bleeding won't stop. The young man laments the loss and says that's why they should have joined the fight sooner. He criticizes the trio's selfish attitude as the first guy finally passes on. The weapon maker is stunned, watching his friends fall one after another. The 3 incredibly strong fighters lose their strength and fall lifeless to the cold ground. Pushing his body to the limit, the young man leans on his sword and says they're a handful even at the end. With great determination, he firmly grips the handle of his golden item, creation hammer. The blacksmith finally gets to his feet with his tools, using the last of his strength. Walking among his fallen friends, he tells them to take better care of their weapons, since they're unusable now. Using the broken blades, he plants the weapons in the ground to serve as markers for his friends. He turns his face away, feeling the weight of the complete silence that has now fallen over the battlefield. Looking at the giant waves getting closer, the survivor feels his time has also come. Looking at his own hand, he decides to use his creation power for the last time in his life. With this idea in mind, he places his hand firmly over his badly wounded chest. A blue energy begins to glow as he activates the power to extract destiny from himself. The system confirms the link with the creator, and a shiny mineral starts to appear in his hand. The extraction is a success, revealing a spirit stone containing the entire essence of his life. This special technique creates unique ores, depending on the power of the connected individual. He regrets not awakening this power sooner, as using it on himself creates an empty stone. Seeing the colorless mineral, he decides to fill the space with all of his regrets. Filled with rage, the young man raises his golden hammer, ready to forge the colorless ore. The giant wave threatens to crash down, but he focuses only on the sound of the hammer, ignoring the approaching danger. The impact sounds incredibly strong, and he remembers that whenever he heard it, amazing things happened. A brilliant light cuts through the skies, proving his final creation was better than expected. But the result looks pretty simple, and he's sad to see a dagger without any awesome powers. Holding the weapon against the light, the blacksmith accepts that he made a completely normal item. Instead of being taken by the water, The warrior decides to end things on his own terms. With a determined look, he brings the blade towards his chest so the sea won't claim victory. He gives a smile, thinking it's crazy that his last action was hammering an oar. Sinking into the darkness, the young man understands the origin of the strange sound he'd heard since he was a kid. That constant noise in his head was actually the sound of the cursed sea itself. He thinks everything would have been different if he had used his skills to help others sooner. Regret hits him hard, and then the dagger in his vision starts to glow in a crazy way. The system reacts to his feelings and shows the true form of the item he forged. A secret ability called Return to Origin is activated, unleashing an insane power. The young man wakes up confused, not getting how he survived, and a teacher yells his name. In shock, the young man realizes he went back in time, exactly to the day of his entrance exam. He realizes he went back 31 years into the past to the forge and wonders if this is a dream. Then, the image of the dagger he created before he passed on appears right in front of him. The young man understands that the dagger's skill sent him back, as a teacher calls out to warn him. The man threatens to expel him if he doesn't do the work right, and the young man just nods. Holding the hammer, he finally accepts that he really got a second chance at everything. He wonders if this time he can change everything by using his skill and the hammer sooner. But he pushes those thoughts aside and decides the important thing is to seize the chance he has now. With a very determined look, he gets ready to show what he's truly capable of. A confident smile appears on his face because he knows exactly what to do now. The blacksmith promises that this time, he will protect everything and everyone important to him. His first goal is pretty simple, and he decides for sure that he will get into Babel. To do that, the first step will be to find his old, dear battle partners again. The sound of his hammer gets the teacher's attention, who looks surprised in the boy's direction. He notices that the young blacksmith's posture completely changed out of nowhere right then. The impact is dead on, and the sparks flying from the forge shine in a very different way. The teacher is blown away by the rhythm, and the clean sound of the hammer strikes the boy was making. He recognizes that the guy's forging skills are on a much higher level. At that, the white-haired man moves closer to get a better look at the young man's work. The final result is a sword with a level of perfection that no one there had ever seen before. The assistant is in complete shock and can't believe the young man made that. The teacher smiles, satisfied, and thinks that an incredible candidate has finally appeared at the academy. With this result, he would be approved instantly, but the young man raises his hammer once more. To everyone's surprise, the blacksmith shatters his own creation into several pieces right there. The young man admits he has a long way to go, but can't accept presenting that piece of junk. For him, as a true blacksmith, turning in a bad piece of work is something he just can't do. The assistant gets upset by his attitude, and the protagonist turns to the exam proctor. Looking the teacher in the eyes, the young man firmly asks to redo his task. The helper tries to say something, but the teacher calls him by name and tells him to be quiet. He then tells the assistant to bring all the leftover materials for the candidate. The white-haired guy asks if this goes against the rules, and the other nervously denies it. With no other choice, the assistant runs to get the new materials for the young blacksmith. The teacher turns to the young man and stares at him with a serious look, wanting an answer. He warns that there are only 40 minutes left until the end of the exam, and the boy just confirms. Then he asks if the candidate still thinks breaking the weapon was the right thing to do. The young blacksmith stays silent for a second, his eyes full of self-confidence. Then he answers with certainty that he could never turn in a piece of work like that. Satisfied with the answer, the teacher smiles and tells the young man to do his best then. The candidate's eyes shine with new energy, and he prepares for the new challenge. He knows that forging something perfect with his current body is tough since he lacks mana and strength, but the experienced blacksmith has a plan and knows the best choice for this situation. A strange noise catches the attention of another candidate who was working nearby. The teacher notices the young man is putting mana into the fire stone and gets alarmed by the danger. Ignoring the danger, the young man uses his energy to control several stones at once. The other candidate is shocked to see the scene and thinks the protagonist has gone crazy. Suddenly, a rainbow-colored flame explodes around the blacksmith's body. The young man panics at the fire and starts screaming desperately, asking for an extinguisher. The assistant also panics, but the teacher stops him and tells him not to do anything. He then tells the helper to look closely at the way the flames are moving. The weapon creator remains calm in the middle of the fire that dances around him without burning him. This is the 5-color fire forge technique, which uses 5 ignition stones together. The skill requires perfect mana control, but uses very little energy to perform. The other blacksmith doesn't understand how nothing exploded and notices something different happening there. The iron bar on the anvil starts to change color because of the fire's high temperature. The teacher understands that he used the stone's resonance to change and heat the iron. This will greatly reduce the forging time, but with 30 minutes left, it's still tight. His previous forging was great, but if that was all he could do, it wouldn't be enough. The instructor believes that even with all his effort, the candidate won't make it in time, but the young blacksmith speeds up his hammering at an incredible, almost superhuman pace. A slight smile appears on his face, because he's sure he will finish the work. With one last move, he finishes the blade and plunges it into the flames to harden it. The hot metal is dipped into the colorful flames for the final tempering process. The effort is immense, and sweat drips down his face, but he remains focused on the job. He goes back to hammering the base of the blade with precise, forceful strikes to finish it. Suddenly, he stops working, feeling a sharp pain, and his hand starts bleeding a lot. He realizes his mana protection ran out and complains about his weak body from this time. Even with his hand all messed up, he grips the hammer even tighter, not giving up. The young man knows he can't lose a single second and raises the hammer again. With determination, he decides to push his body to the limit to finish in time. Time flies by, and there are only 10 minutes left, then 3, until the end of the big exam. With only 1 minute remaining, he sharpens the blade carefully and in a great hurry. The instructor shouts for him to stop because the exam time has officially just ended. The young man breathes a sigh of relief for managing to finish everything right at the last second. His hand is a wreck and covered in injuries, but he managed to complete the challenge. He raises the finished sword, and the system announces the weapon's completion and a new skill. The 5-color fire sword is classified as high level and has cool powers. The other candidates are shocked to hear that the weapon he made is high grade. He asks the teacher to look at the details, and the assistant panics at the result. With wide eyes, the helper shouts that he managed to pass the entrance exam. The teacher scolds him for shouting, and the young man apologizes, all embarrassed by it. Later, the protagonist is called for a talk in Professor Kim's office. The teacher looks at him in silence while the young man waits, sitting on the sofa. The instructor then asks if he thinks the sword he forged was worth it. The young man answers that for now, yes, and the white-haired man stares at him from the window. The teacher notices that the young man still isn't satisfied and decides to tell him the truth. He warns him that this place won't be enough for his talent and suggests he give up. Babel has a very good reputation, but the forging department hasn't been getting good results. The young man isn't surprised, as this is information he already knew from the future. He remembers that Babel's department closes in 8 years, and Vulcan Academy becomes the best. When the teacher suggests Vulcan will be the best, the young man cuts him off and says he's wrong. With a fiery look, he guarantees that Babel will be the best because he's going to enroll there. The young man insists that the teacher is wrong about which academy will be the best in the world. He pats his own chest and states that Babel will be the best because that's where he's going to study. The teacher is left speechless by so much confidence coming from the young candidate in front of him. He lowers his head, thinking hard and processing the young man's bold declaration. The man then challenges him to get first place in the course, and the young man accepts immediately. The instructor then asks if he knows the method for choosing Babel's top freshmen. The young man explains that the top 2 from each course take a new exam to decide the best. Babel Academy is divided into 3 large departments with various courses within them. These are the combat, support, and technical departments, where he is right now. Each of these departments has dozens of very different specializations, and the title of top freshman is given to the one with the best grades in all areas. The teacher clenches his fist on his leg, looking like he's made an important decision. He decides to speak not as a teacher, but as an older blacksmith to the young man. He warns him that even if he's the best here, he won't do well and should go to Vulcan. With a serious look, the man says this is the best path the young man can follow. The young man smiles, realizing the teacher is putting his future above the academy's. But the young man says the environment doesn't matter to him, and the instructor stares back at him. With a smile, he states that the Babel he is in will become the best of all. The teacher is shocked by the idea that wherever he goes will become the best place. To him, this is a statement that goes beyond confidence and borders on pure arrogance. But he extends his hand and says he looks forward to working with the young man. The young man shakes the teacher's hand, and the two seal the new agreement with great respect. At that moment, a bond is created between the two, and the system reacts instantly. With the bond formed, he activates his special ability to extract the teacher's power. A bluish energy appears, and an ore with unique powers begins to form in his hand. The extraction is completed and reveals a very high-quality fire-imbued iron. Night falls, and we see a dark, quiet street somewhere in the big city. Already in his room, the young man analyzes the ore he managed to extract from his instructor. He thinks the result isn't bad, but is a little sad about the size of the stone. This ability extracts the relationship with someone and creates minerals that didn't exist before. The ore floats above his bandaged hand, while a blue aura surrounds him completely. The problem is that the bond level is still low, and his stats are bad right now. He thinks it's a shame, but figures he returned to the past for a pretty low price in the end. With a determined look, he knows he can't rush and needs to take things very slowly. The young man thinks it would be selfish to wait any longer, and that there's still time to destroy Pandemonium. This is the organization of monsters that threaten not just humanity, but the entire planet. To stop them, he will use everything he can, and for that, he needs something to remember the future. The first part of his plan, which was to get into Babel Academy, is now complete. He wonders what the next step will be, and a system message appears for him. His eyes widen in surprise as he sees the new message from the bluish system. The system informs him that his bond level has risen to 1, and a new skill has been added. 1 week later, he arrives at Babel Academy for his first official day of classes. He walks through the academy's hallways, complaining that he got lost again on the way. He finally finds the forging room and realizes it's the right place for him to be. As soon as he enters, a man calls him by name, and he tries to greet him with a "good morning." He notices the room is full, and that everyone there seems to have been waiting for him. One of the men taps his finger on the table and comments that the young man seems pretty relaxed. This is Michael, the vice director, who complains about him making everyone wait. But Professor Kim defends him and points out that there are still 10 minutes before the exam starts. Michael says it's not a matter of time, but of the new student's attitude. The young man realizes the professor has problems with his bosses and understands the situation. Now he understands why the professor recommended another academy to him before. Michael stares at him in silence with a look of clear disapproval on his face. His blue eyes show all the anger he feels about the freshman's tardiness. He crosses his arms and walks away without saying another word, but his displeasure is very clear. He formally introduces himself to the young man, who is confused by the sudden greeting. Just then, a woman enters the room, apologizing for being late and asking if everyone has arrived. She approaches with a confident stride and sits in the chair that belongs to the professor. The young man is startled to see who it is and recognizes her instantly with great surprise. The vice director greets her as director, and she apologizes again for being late. The protagonist is in shock to see that woman there in front of him once again. Suddenly, the two are transported to a mental space created by the woman. She is Ryu Yunha, the academy's director, and she apologizes for her short delay. The young man can't believe she's there and wonders what the reason for it is. He knew she had worked at Babel for a while, but he didn't expect this. To think she was the head of the academy's professors was something completely unexpected. This is the S-rank heroine known as the Weapon Devourer, the famous Ryu Yunha. Before his return in time, she was a client who always negotiated with him. He remembers a rainy day when he found her injured in a dark alley. She apologized for having devoured his weapon during a very difficult battle. The young man watched her in silence as the rain poured down on both of them endlessly. She seemed regretful and in pain, but he showed no reaction at the time. He just stood there, looking at her with a very serious expression on his face. The scene was sad, with the two of them alone in the middle of the rain and surrounding destruction. Back in the present, the director calls him by name, pulling him out of his memories. He answers highs, and she prepares to give the instructions for their new exam. She warns that she will explain the exam and asks him to pay close attention to the rules. Professor Kim informs them that the total exam time will be exactly 90 minutes. During this time, the two must create a weapon that matches the exam's sword. But there is a special condition for creating the new equipment this time. For this exam, they must use only the alchemy forge to make the piece. The professor points to a pile of materials that were prepared for the test. They can use any of the ores that have been made available to them. The director and vice director will be the judges who will evaluate the created weapons. Professor Kim extends his arm and gives the signal for them to begin the exam. The two candidates face each other with challenging looks, and the test finally begins. The young man ties on his apron and thinks about the alchemy forge he'll have to use now. He remembers that this technique uses only pure mana to create resonance in the forge. The other candidate provokes him and asks if he thinks his mana will grow just by looking. The young man turns to him and asks if he was talking to him at that moment. The professor calls him by name and tells him to focus on the exam that's about to start. He tells the young man to avoid making comments that have nothing to do with the test. The blonde guy apologizes, and the protagonist notices that his last name is the same as the vice director's. He wonders in shock if that guy is the son of the test's judge. Now he understands the resemblance between the two and the other candidate's arrogance. The young man smiles and says it seems the young blacksmith has finally noticed the situation. With a smug smile, he confirms that he is the son of the academy's vice director. He brags about his important family and his power that goes head to head with upperclassmen. He picks up a blue ore and says the exam's result has been decided from the beginning. With the ore in his hand, he states with total certainty that victory is already his. The vice director comments that lazulite and hanamok are materials with a lot of mana inside. Professor Kim adds that water mana is sensitive to fire and difficult to forge. The blonde guy says that's a thing of the past and that forging methods have changed a lot. The professor explains that forging time varies, but that it would take about 30 minutes. The vice director smiles with pride and says his son can do it in 30 minutes. The image shows the young man using his alchemy to synthesize the ores very quickly. A 30-minute synthesis is something not even second-year students can do. The professor understands the plan and realizes the setup behind the exam's rules. He gets upset seeing that the theme was chosen to help the vice director's son. The director smiles and says that should work to balance the competition a little. The protagonist chooses his materials and picks up an ice stone and fire flowers. The professor is surprised to see the choice of hydrate and wall hung sick for the forge. Michael comments that he doesn't know the young man's skills, but knows he's very proud. He watches the young man with a look of contempt and curiosity about what he will do. The blonde guy wonders if his opponent chose those ores to contrast with his own. He thinks the young man is an idiot and says he will never be able to control Wahang, sick. With a confident smile, he thinks victory will be even easier than he imagined. Suddenly, his eyes widen in shock as he sees something completely unexpected happen. The system announces that the bound engraving skill has been activated by the protagonist. With the new ability, he can equip items to his arms to increase his power. The system confirms that the Iron of Harmony has been successfully equipped to his right arm. Golden flames envelop his arm, and he smiles with the new strength he feels in his body. The other candidate complains about his opponent's useless tricks, but seems worried. The flames dance in his hand, and he prepares to begin the creation process. He uses the iron's power to manipulate the ores with incredible precision. The fire and ice ores float in the air, enveloped by a strong, golden energy. With a smile on his face, he controls the elements with mastery and great skill. The judges watch the scene, impressed with the control he's showing. Michael wonders if he is using the same attribute to create the resonance. If he forces the resonance like this, the attribute's mana could go out of control. He smiles wickedly, hoping the idiot will finally cause an accident in the test. The flames envelop the young man's arm with more force, but he remains in control. The other candidate begins his own forging process with a bluish energy. The director and the professor are startled by the firepower the protagonist unleashes. The energy concentrates and forms a sphere of fire, ready to be used in the creation. The young man blows a bit of smoke, and the smelting process continues without any problems. The system announces that the Iron of Harmony has been unequipped, and the weapon is complete. Michael is in shock and can't believe he managed to finish the piece. The new weapon is a sheath that stores and enhances fire mana, and allows the use of a skill. Hans is stunned and wonders how he managed to synthesize the materials so quickly. To him, it's impossible to use attribute mana without it going completely out of control. He starts to doubt everything he knew and wonders if he's been wrong all this time. His eyes widen at the thought that his techniques might be wrong. Michael shouts for him to stop because putting a tribute matter into a mana stone is dangerous. But it's too late, and the bluish energy starts to become unstable in his hands. The mana stone glows very brightly, and rays of energy escape his control. The stone shatters into 1,000 pieces, releasing a wave of uncontrolled energy. A large explosion of blue light fills the room, covering everything around it. Later, in the Academy's exam hall, the dust from the explosion begins to settle. Pieces of blue ore are scattered all over the floor of the testing room. Hans stares at his opponent, his face bruised but his gaze not looking weak. The protagonist says that normally, after the evaluation of the two candidates in the test, one of them would be recommended as the best for the Academy's graduation program. Professor Kim laments the situation, as the exam result is now complicated. Hans is standing with his hand on his arm, his body trembling with anger and humiliation. He can't believe he lost the competition, without even getting a chance to fight. A contemptuous smile appears on the vice director's face as he sees the ugly scene. He says a student got hurt, and that the best thing would be to nullify the test and do a new one. But Professor Kim argues that they can't erase an exam that already happened. The vice director accuses him of caring more about results than the student's safety. He stands up and says that from the beginning, the situation was completely nonsensical. The fastest resonance speed ever recorded at the Academy was 5 minutes. He points to the young man and questions if it makes sense for a freshman to achieve that so quickly. The young man doesn't answer and just stares at him while the system explains alchemy forging. This technique doesn't force the ore, but seeks its root to extract its true life. This is the essence of alchemy forging that the protagonist managed to achieve. He explains that this is a method that will be normal in a few years, so there's no secret. but he refuses to explain it to an old man who only knows how to give orders and yell at him. The vice director smiles wickedly and concludes that the young man cheated to win. He says it's impossible for a freshman to create a rare, grade weapon without using some trick. The young blacksmith gets irritated by the accusation and glares at him with eyes full of anger. The director slams her hand on the table and says the whole situation is ridiculous and makes no sense. The vice director agrees with her and asks for the freshman to be expelled for cheating. He expects her to announce a new test, but she just stares at him in silence. Professor Kim is also surprised by the director's reaction and calls her by her title. She picks up the sheath the young man forged and analyzes it with care and attention to detail. She says that this is absurd and holds the weapon with a serious, focused expression. A tear rolls down from her eye, and she seems completely shocked by what she sees. She then turns to the protagonist and calls him by name with an astonished look. With her eyes shining, she asks for just one bite of the weapon and then just one lick. The two men don't understand anything and stare at her with expressions of pure confusion. The scene becomes funny with the director begging for a little taste of the weapon he created. The whole room falls into an awkward silence as she continues with her request. That afternoon in the city, the young man walks through the streets, thinking about what happened. He meets his friend who is waiting for him, and the two start talking about the exam. He analyzes the sheath and admits that the overall quality isn't bad, but the adjustments are poor. But he knows it has potential and that he can improve a lot with time and practice. He laughs as he remembers the vice director trembling with rage and finds the scene very amusing. Suddenly, he stops, and the name Barmet sounds familiar from somewhere in his past. He repeats the name to himself, trying to remember where he knows it from in the past. He remembers when a guy at Babel made him an errand boy and his armor exploded. That's how he got the scar on his face from the manirecap. The friend with the scar remembers that day with anger and how everything happened. The protagonist stops walking as he remembers an important detail from his past. The blacksmith who left Louise Vallant with permanent injuries was named Barmet. His first goal in this life was to find the three guys and settle the score. He smiles as he realizes he doesn't need to search anymore, because one of them is already here. If Hans hadn't lost control, there would have been no reason for the attacks to worsen. In the academy's meeting room, the director proposes naming the young man as the top student. The teachers from other courses are shocked and ask if she's being serious. The director faces them with a challenging look and asks if anyone there has anything against it. One of the teachers says it's nothing against it, but rather some advice for her. Michael comments that the director is new to the position and maybe doesn't fully understand the situation. She stares at him with a cold, direct gaze, not letting herself be intimidated by the comment. Another teacher says the young man's weapon was incredible, but that they need to look closer. Professor Kim defends the young man and says they didn't see the fire-shattering blade. One of the teachers reads the report and admits it's incredible but questions if it's enough. The director says the weapon is less than 60% of what he wanted to create. With a slight smile, she begins to explain the young blacksmith's true potential. She says that if even after his demonstration they don't accept, it's a problem. Then she threatens to leave her position as department head if they don't accept him. The story begins 54 years ago when the Tower of Heroes descended from the heavens. In response, the underworld released a swamp of demons that threatened all life. Babel was created in this chaos and became the largest academy in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Emperor of Ascension, Ludwig Schubert, says that everyone there will join the heroes. He encourages the new students to march forward, as this is their duty now. The young man stares at the emperor and listens carefully to the words of the welcome speech. The famous Ludwig Schubert is an imposing and respected figure by all who are there. The protagonist thinks he seems like a nice guy but knows he's no saint. The master of ceremonies announces that the demonstration of the top students will begin. The top students from each college are called to come up to the main stage. The young man remembers how the top students from his past life were arrogant. He holds his sword firmly and prepares for the demonstration that's about to happen. With a smile, he realizes that now he understands the reason for all the swagger they had. The announcer says that the item used in the demonstration is right there on the stage. A robot with glowing red eyes suddenly appears in the middle of the combat arena. This is the Automaton Model S, a combat golem with the power of a C-rank hero. The young man wonders if the robot is the type that fights hand to hand since it has no weapons. The announcer calls the first participant, who is from the combat college, to fight. He announces the demonstration of Jake Myers, the top student of Aculcup, to begin. The students position themselves in the round arena to start the first demonstration. The protagonist remembers that Jakey is the third son of the Myers family and chose to fight. Jake prepares for combat with his fists clenched and a confident smile on his face. The automaton advances towards him with its red eyes, focused on the target in front of it. The announcer gives the signal, and the fight begins with the two facing each other in the arena. The robot advances with its fist ready to deliver a super strong blow against the young man. It moves with speed and attacks the young man with a series of fast and accurate strikes. Jake dodges the attacks with agility and prepares to counter-attack the automaton. The exchange of blows is very intense, and the two move around the arena at high speed. He moves away from the robot and positions himself to launch his own special attack. With a smile, he says that now it's his turn to attack and prepares to finish it. He advances with a very powerful punch that hits the robot squarely with great force. His eyes glow with energy, and he concentrates all his power into a single blow. The impact is so strong that the robot is thrown back with its entire body damaged. The other students watch the fight, impressed by Jake's skill and strength. His fist hits the ground, and the impact creates a small crater in the arena floor. The protagonist is surprised because he heard that he debuted as an A rank in his early 20s. With this ability, he is a rare talent even within Babel Academy. He wonders why in his past life he peaked as a simple A rank. Jake concentrates his energy and prepares to deliver the final blow in the battle now. With a very powerful kick, he completely destroys the automaton into several pieces. The robot's parts fly across the arena as he finishes the fight with great style. The automaton's body falls to the ground, completely destroyed and with no chance of moving. Jake stretches and says it's been a while since he stretched out in such a good way. The announcer is speechless with the demonstration of power he just witnessed. The other students are also shocked to see that he defeated the robot with a single blow. Jake waves to the crowd, who applauds him enthusiastically for the overwhelming victory. The young man thinks that he really hyped up the crowd and that the next one will feel the pressure. Next up is the top student from the support college, Cadet Erica Inu. He thinks that she's the top student from and doesn't need to worry about the pressure. Erica is the eldest daughter of the Inu family, one of the 3 most famous families. In the future, she becomes a demon and is eliminated by the hands of her own family. He knows she is destined to be corrupted, and it's not worth getting close to her. Suddenly, he notices that she is looking at him and gets confused by the attention. He wonders why she looked at him and watches her go up the stage stairs. The automaton for her demonstration is equipped with armor and is stronger. Its defense is 1.5 times greater than the normal models, which is difficult. She holds a cage with a crow inside and stares at it with a very mysterious look. Her eyes glow with a blue energy, and she releases the crow from the cage to attack. The crow flies out of the cage, and its black wings spread in the middle of the arena. The giant crow flies over the arena and faces the automaton with its sharp talons. The young man is surprised and wonders if that is really a normal battle crow. The robot prepares for the attack and aims its weapon in the direction of the bird in the sky. It enters defense mode and protects itself with its very strong energy shields. Protagonist analyzes the situation and says, it will be difficult to break through the robot's defense. Erica faces the automaton with a confident smile and prepares for her attack. The crow transforms into a creature with armor and super sharp metal claws. Its eyes glow with a blue energy, and it looks much stronger than before. With its wings spread, it prepares to dive towards its opponent. The creature flies at high speed and leaves a trail of black feathers in the air. It spins in the air and attacks the robot with a devastating blow that hits it dead on. The young man is shocked by the speed and power of the transformed crow's attack. The automaton is hit, and sparks of energy fly from its body, damaged by the blow. The impact is strong, and the robot can't withstand the enormous power of the attack. It is completely destroyed, and a cloud of smoke spreads across the arena. The crow returns to its normal form and lands on the girl's finger calmly. The crowd goes wild and applauds the incredible demonstration they just saw. The protagonist realizes he'll be kicked off the stage if he just shows off his weapons. Finally, it's his turn, and he is announced as the top student from the College of Technology. The demonstration supervisor, Ludwig Schubert, watches as the next student is called to the stage. He comments that the new students are very good and wonders if the guy from the forge will hold up, but the other supervisor, Ryu Yuna, says confidently that he'll be just fine in the arena. The crowd and the audience wonders excitedly if the young man will surpass the previous presentations. In response, the protagonist steps into the arena and draws his sword with a super fast motion. The system shows that the 5-color fire blade and its sheath are of advanced level. The other students are shocked to see that a freshman managed to make a rare item, but some think the impact is weak, and his rival Hans smiles, thinking he's got this. With a smile, he thinks the position of head of the college will finally be his. Director Yunha, however, watches everything with a serious and very focused look on the fight. The announcer calls for a D-rank robot, but the young man interrupts him, saying no. He then asks for model number 8 to be equipped with extra defensive armor. Shocked, the guy with the microphone asks what the candidate just said. He thinks that Model 8 can already handle a C-rank hero, and now he wants more defense. The Master of Ceremonies wonders if the young blacksmith is trying to mess up his own test. Suddenly, Professor Kim appears and says he brought what the boy asked for the robot. The announcer is speechless to see that the robot was equipped so quickly. With the new armor, the robot is brought to the arena, and the announcer is trembling nervously. Meanwhile, Professor Kim watches the protagonist from a distance without saying a single word. He crosses his arms and gives a slight smirk, showing all his confidence in the student. With a supportive look, he tells the young man to go out there and just wreck everything in the arena. Not knowing what to do, the announcer just decides to let the demonstration begin. He then announces the official start of the last presentation of the year's top students. Professor Kim continues to watch attentively, his arms still crossed over his chest. Director Yunha also keeps her gaze fixed on the young blacksmith, who is on stage. With a confident smile, the young man prepares to show what he's truly capable of. A red aura surrounds him, and he asks if he should meet everyone's expectations. With that, he sheathes the blade, and 5 colored flames explode around him. The young man faces the giant robot, his sword glowing with the colorful flames. Other students are impressed and comment that this is totally insane, but Hans glares at him with contempt and says, "It's all just a show with no real power." The young man explains that the flames have opposing powers, and he stores them in the sheath. By doing this, he forces the flames into the blade, concentrating a huge amount of power. His eyes glow with golden energy, and the system announces that the power is stored. Seeing the energy, the robot activates a powerful defense shield to protect itself from the attack. The young blacksmith unleashes all the stored power in a single, super devastating blow. This is the wildfire skill, which explodes the mana stored inside the sheath. If this skill is used in this state with the power of the 5 colored flames combined, they will all explode at once, releasing a gigantic and powerful force. two teachers in the audience are completely speechless at the scene they just saw. The announcer turns pale and wonders what's wrong with that crazy guy. After the dust settles, the protagonist is alone in the middle of the destroyed arena. Calmly, he sheathes his sword as if nothing had happened there. He then lets out a sigh and wonders if maybe he overdid it a little with the power. On the arena floor, a huge crack runs from one side of the place to the other. The man with the microphone stutters and trembles, unable to say a single word. He then yells for the maintenance team to head to the central auditorium immediately. Later, in a hallway, we see someone walking in check, high-heeled shoes. In the room, the protagonist waits, sitting on the sofa with his arms crossed and a serious look. The director enters, apologizing for the delay because she was helping clean up the arena. But he stands up and says he's the one who should apologize for the whole mess. She stares at him, surprised, and asks what he means by he should have controlled it better. The young man gets confused and asks if she didn't call him there to scold him. She denies it with her hands and says no, and that the reason she called him is different. The two stand in the middle of the room while she seems a bit embarrassed by it all. He is completely lost, not understanding anything that is happening in that room. The director then clears her throat and tries to change the subject to what matters. She says she'll pay 10 times the market price, and he stares at her, completely surprised. With a serious look, she asks if he would be willing to sell his weapon to her. He is shocked by the proposal, and at that moment, the system announces a new bond with Yunha. She praises the incredible equipment he made, and the system confirms a new bond. The young man is surprised because before his return, it took a long time for a bond to form. Thanking her, he thinks that either way, this is a great chance for him. With the bond formed, he immediately activates his special bond extraction ability. A bluish energy appears, and he extracts her potential, creating a new war. The extraction finishes, and a floating red orb appears in the palm of the young man's hand. The director asks if he's going to sell the weapon, but he refuses the offer without a second thought. She questions him since he had just agreed, but Professor Kim cuts her off. The man announces that the director will begin the award ceremony right away. He then asks if he can take the student, Lee Se-hoon, with him to the ceremony. With no choice, the director just agrees and allows the professor to take the young man. The young blacksmith says goodbye and tells her he'll see her later before leaving the room. The woman is left alone in the silent room, processing everything that just happened. The two walk through the academy's main building, the grand and fancy Marduk mansion. Walking through the luxurious hallways, they head towards the director's office. The professor warns him to behave because the director ignored the arena's destruction. He says the man is on a completely different level from everyone else there. But the young man calmly replies for him not to worry, as he knows what to do. A voice calls the student's name and invites him to enter a very dark room. This is Ludwig, the Emperor of Ascension, and the powerful director of Babel Academy. The young man remembers that he was the hero who destroyed one of the demon gods all by himself. With a serious look, the young man thinks that's to be expected from a true ascender. The director says the equipment from the demonstration was very interesting and eye-catching. He then comments that something is still missing, but that he's looking forward to the young man's future. The young man thinks the comment makes him want to throw everything he's created into a furnace. The director says that as a prize for his notable talent and effort at the academy, he will give the young man not one, but 2 special rewards for his merit. With a smile, he tells the young man to say what he needs, and the young man thinks about the offer. The blacksmith then asks for rewards that can increase his mana and his memory. The image shows the director's hands moving in a gesture of creating a magic item. A golden shield with a lock symbol shines brightly in front of him. The system shows 2 items, one that absorbs mana and another that connects to dreams. He is shocked because the anicap is an incredibly rare item and hard to find. The young man smiles and says that although it's difficult to use, He already has a good idea of what to do. The director then asks with a satisfied look if the young man liked the rewards. With a smirk, the protagonist replies that the items are simply perfect. A woman observes the scene from afar and asks the director what he is thinking. To her, it's strange that he gave 2 rewards at once to him. The man replies that he only gave the items because the boy has the capacity to use them. He adds that the young man has enough depth to appear that way. With a glint in his golden eye, the man continues his analysis of the student. The director admits to himself that even he can't understand the young man's depth. The scene changes to one of the academy buildings, with a large clock in front of it. The protagonist enters the classroom and sees all the students already seated. A classmate asks Hans where he wants to have lunch, and the blonde guy says he has plans with an upperclassman. The other is shocked to learn that he's meeting the top student of the 3rd year. Hans brags that their families are close, and the upperclassman is going to give him advice. At that moment, the protagonist approaches and asks if he can come along too. The young man's eyes shine with a golden hue, and he stares at the blonde guy with a cold gaze. Silence falls over the room, and everyone looks at the young man standing in front of the desk. The blacksmith keeps his gaze fixed on Hans, who seems uncomfortable with the situation. The blonde guy gets irritated and asks what the problem is with the look the young man gave him. The protagonist just walks away and goes to his seat without saying another word. Hans is furious and clenches his fists in anger for being challenged like that. Professor Kim enters the room and tells all the students to take their seats. Standing in front of the class, he confirms that everyone is present for the first lesson. He says that since it's the first class, they should start with proper introductions. The professor shows a box full of stones and says that it is a projection alloy. He explains that this item is 10 times more sensitive to mana than normal ores. Because of this, if mana is put into it, the equipment of the mind is easily created. The young man thinks it's no wonder the professor is on the list of the world's 100 best artisans. He then gets serious as he realizes there's something wrong with the bond stone. The created projection sword shatters, and the young man senses the man has a problem. The professor says that because it's sensitive, the item is difficult to use, but reflects hidden traits. That's why this equipment made from the projection alloy is called an alter ego. He announces that the creations will be on display for a week, and everyone agrees with him. A student comments that that amount of alloy costs 10 million each, and is impressed. Hans shows off his golden sword and brags about his skills with the projection alloy, but the protagonist laments because no one there has the most important talent of all. Finally, the professor calls him, and he stands up to do his own demonstration. He holds the alloy and thinks he doesn't need to hide his power, since he's already the best there. A red energy appears, and the stone starts to glow very brightly in his hand. With a determined look, he decides he will use all his power at once. A bluish light illuminates the entire room, with the energy released by his projection. Later in the main hall, many students are looking at the alter ego's exhibition. They comment that it's funny to say he's on another level when he's just a freshman. The 2 students continue talking about the demonstration they saw earlier. A sign says an anomaly occurred, and he absorbed the alloys around his own. The students think it was a coincidence, and that he used multiple alloys to show off. But a black-haired girl says she thinks a little differently from everyone else there. Just then, Jake approaches her and says he also agrees with what she said before. He comments that that amount of alloy wasn't enough to express the young man. At the forge, a piece of metal is heated until it's red and ready to be shaped. The assistant asks if he marked the time, because there wasn't even 1,000th of a second of error. The older man wonders what he should teach a boy like that. He then decides to skip the young man's demonstration because no one there would want to see it. After class, the protagonist stays in the forge, working on his new creations. A blue aura surrounds him as he focuses completely on his work with the hammer. He looks at the blades he made and thinks about what he needs to do to improve even more. Suddenly, the assistant asks if he is going to break the creations again. The young blacksmith is startled by the question and turns to the young man in front of him. The assistant warns that he can't break them because they need to be turned in after this week's class. He explains that Babel supports them based on the sales performance of their weapons. Then the man asks what the young man is dissatisfied with, whether it's his body or his mana. The young man smiles and replies that right now, his problem is with his own body. He says that to create training tools, he needs to smelt heavy ore, but doesn't have the strength. The assistant suggests that if it's necessary for smelting, he could try something else. For the young man, it would be faster to receive a buff than to do physical training. The protagonist smiles because he never thought of this method he used to avoid before returning. He thinks that now that his stamina is low, he'll be able to smelt the ore with a buff. Thanking him for the advice, the young man bows to the assistant as a sign of respect. The assistant then says that during forging, he is making a big mistake. He warns him that he's using too much mana and should reduce it by 70%. With a satisfied smile, the young man agrees and says that will be much better. The assistant is shocked and wonders if a freshman just gave him advice. He turns away in silence and seems to think about what the young man just told him. Babel encourages self-learning and allows students to take classes from other colleges. But if a student accumulates 3 bad grades, they are immediately expelled from the academy. The young man gets on a train, and the next station announced is the ore department. The doors open, and he gets off the train for his next class of the day at the academy. Suddenly, he sees Erica and her 2 bodyguards coming towards him in the hallway. One of the men glares at him angrily and tells him to get out of the way so he doesn't block the path. The protagonist is confused and replies that they are the ones who should get out of the way. The young man and his friends are surprised and annoyed by the bold response. Erica stares at him with a serious look and asks where he is going at that moment. He replies that he's going to the enchantment department to see if he can take a minor at that. She offers to guide him, and the bodyguard is shocked by her decision. The man warns that they have a meeting, but she tells them to go alone this time. He insists and says the upperclassman really wanted her to be present at the meeting, but she glares at him with a cold look and says she's not the least bit interested. The young man observes the girl in silence with an analytical and very attentive look. The 2 walk side by side, and he stares at her without saying a single word on the way. She then asks what kind of minor course he is looking for at the academy right now. He replies that he's trying to learn about buffs, and she asks what kind. The young man says he's looking for buffs that improve physical abilities without interfering. At that, she suggests barrier magic, and he questions if it's not for defense. The girl replies that it can vary depending on how the magic is used by the user. A magic circle appears, and she demonstrates her skill with barrier magic. With the invitation in hand, she asks him to try to tear it with all his strength. He tries to tear it but realizes the paper is incredibly resistant in his hands. The envelope maintains its properties, but hardens when a force is applied. The young man says it's a technique that combines well with smelting because of the adjustments. She then reveals that the barrier construction professor is a relative of her family. He notices that the envelope's seal has changed and understands what she did with the magic. The image shows Erica surprised by the chains he broke on the envelope. She is shocked that he understood and broke her family's magic so quickly. The young man thanks her for the advice and says he will sign up for the barrier classes. He then says goodbye and tells her to go eat with the guys who are following them. The bodyguards run over worried and ask if she's okay after the encounter. On the ground, the torn pieces of the invitation reveal the word Noblesse written on it. She glares at the guys and says with a serious look that that was what she was giving him. The 2 arrive at Or's enchantment department with its imposing architecture. Everyone is talking about Erica walking around with someone from another college. The protagonist smiles and thinks that if she liked him, a bond would have already formed. He wonders if they really select students for classes carefully. Erica takes him to a testing area, and he's surprised to see that it's a forest. A young man complains in frustration because he can't find what he's looking for. The protagonist observes the scene and wonders if the test is some kind of treasure hunt. To him, it all seems like a big waste of time, and he stares at the forest. Suddenly, he steps on something, and a barrier of blue crystals rises from the ground. The two instructors are surprised to see that he found the barrier so quickly. One of them turns to the young man and says with a trembling voice that he passed the test. The young man is confused by the situation and doesn't understand what just happened. Later, Professor Robert Perry comments on the young woman's interest in the top cadet. One of the instructors shows a photo on his phone, and the professor asks to take a look. He comments that he wondered why she signed up for a beginner's course. Now he understands but complains that the number of applicants has tripled because of her. The professor thinks that he received a request from the Inno Harris he needs to act. This year, he will add a test using the dangerous labyrinth of perplexity. This is a barrier that distorts the senses and forces a person to walk aimlessly. He thinks that she didn't help him, and yet he passed through the labyrinth with his instincts. The instructor announces that everyone passed the first test, to the students' delight. He then says they will do the second test, and a young man volunteers to be the first. With a smile, he thinks this is his chance to get Erica's attention. The instructor explains that they must dismantle a barrier using only their mana. With the signal, the students begin the test by touching a red spider web. The spider in the center flees from the mana, and the web regenerates as long as it's there. The first young man complains that his mana isn't enough to surround the entire formula. He then decides he will use his speed to overload the spider with energy. The instructor marks 2 minutes and 23 seconds and advises him to study the structure. The young man thanks him, embarrassed, and Erica glares at him with a disapproving expression. The instructor calls the next one, and they all fail one after another without success. The professor says they will all start in the beginner's class because of the result. Finally, he calls Erica Inno to do her test, and she prepares to begin. With a focused look, she approaches the barrier and stares at it in silence. She touches the web with her fingertips, and a wave of white energy spreads out. The spider web completely dissolves under the girl's delicate touch. The other students are shocked at the speed with which she dismantled the formula. A green-haired girl comments that this is the difference for the top cadet. The instructor marks 22 seconds and says the textbook method would be faster. The instructor calls the protagonist's name, and now it's his turn to take the test. The young man doesn't seem to have anything special, and the instructor thinks he'll have to analyze him. But the young man crouches down and analyzes the barrier carefully and with great attention to detail. At this, Erica and her friends wonder what he is doing, and if he doesn't know it has already started. The blacksmith then realizes that the barrier has similarities to heavy weight ore. This barrier restores itself, so the stimuli need to be balanced. The instructor is also confused and doesn't understand what the candidate is doing just standing there. And just as the man was about to intervene, Erica stops him and tells him to leave the young man alone. The instructor sighs and decides to follow the girl's advice for now without saying anything. He then decides to trap the accumulated stimuli inside the barrier all at once. With that, a fiery energy explodes with force in the center of the red spider web. The other students watch from a distance as small flames surround the protagonist. With his hands on the ground, the young blacksmith says with a smile that he's already finished the job. He thinks that with this, he can simply force the dismantling equation. The young man takes a step back, moving away from the area that is now in flames. He then stands up confidently while Erica and the others watch him from afar. At that, the assistant marks 7 minutes and 45 seconds on his stopwatch. But the professor says the time doesn't matter because he could do it in seconds if he tried again. He realizes the young man didn't undo the barrier, but created a new equation for it. Erica watches him in silence, seeming impressed with the skill he showed. The professor thinks that, if he combines his skills with enchantments, it will be incredible. Meanwhile, the assistant is in his office, and wonders how many professors will show up. Just then, his phone receives several messages from professors interested in the available position. He notices that no one from Michael's class showed up, and that the atmosphere there is bad. With the messages in hand, the assistant thinks it's now time to choose someone. Suddenly, his eyes widen in shock at a new message that has arrived. The message says that the dean himself will supervise the young man's forging session. At the forge, the young man is confused when a voice says it's been a while since they've seen each other. A red-haired woman says that as dean, she came to see his skills up close. He turns to the forge and says that in that case, he will do his best on the job. The first step of forging is with a heavy rock, and there are many ways to deal with it. But the most difficult process of all is known as the black veil process. He places the heavy rock in a dark space and waits for it to become liquid. With this, he separates the impurities using only mana and increases the rock's purity. He thinks it seems easy, but in reality, it's like restructuring matter itself. The dean watches him in silence, with a surprised expression on her face at what she sees. He wonders if 25% is the best he can do with the ore. Then he prepares for the second step, and a red energy appears in his hand. A large amount of red flame surrounds him as the dean watches him. The young man channels his mana through the red flame to filter out the perfect sparks. The stabilized flame is called Oya, fire, and maintains a constant temperature. The third step is to strike the rock with a hammer imbued with the Hoya, fire. The dean thinks that even though he's resistant to fire, he can still feel a lot of pain. She wonders how much he has been pushing himself to reach this level of power. Time passes, and the sun begins to set on the horizon of Babel Academy slowly. The dean yawns, a little tired after so much time watching his work, but she continues to stand there by the window, watching the young blacksmith's every move. After 4 hours of work, the young man continues hammering without stopping for a second. After absorbing the flames, the heavy rock finally begins to transform. The distortion stops, and he begins to melt the processed rock in a cauldron. With a pair of tongs, he prepares to pour the molten material into a mold. The dean is surprised to see that he is going to use casting instead of forging the piece. She wonders what he is thinking as he begins the fourth step of the process. He uses a barrier breaking formula to create a mana circuit in the piece. The mana circuit is formed inside the mold with impressive precision. The system announces the completion of the obsidian prayer beads, a legendary item. He learned a new skill and looks at the mess the creation made in the room. The rare great item absorbs and stores the user's mana, increasing their power. With a satisfied smile, the young blacksmith says to himself that he did it. The dean is shocked, and her stomach rumbles with hunger after so much time. The young man faces the dean, who is embarrassed because her stomach rumbled with hunger. He takes a deep breath, satisfied with the result of his long and hard work at the forge. She wonders if the noise was a resonance phenomenon, and he confirms that it was. He thinks the rings aren't strong, but if used together, they could have a set bonus. The young man apologizes for not being able to give her the item, but offers a piece of the material as a snack. He stares at her with a serious look as she takes the piece of ore he offered. A red aura surrounds her, and the system shows her unique ability, Soul Furnace. She eats the ore and comments with surprise that it's very tasty, and he is shocked. With a thoughtful look, she says that to explain it better, it tastes like pieces of tempura. He finds the comparison strange and wonders if he's gotten used to her taste. With a smile, he says he's glad she liked it and thinks it's an easy way to raise the bond. But she laments that it's a shame to eat the materials when they're right in front of her. She then changes the subject and asks when he will process the other materials he has. He replies that he doesn't plan to sell the items, and she is surprised by his refusal. With a smile, he says he's saving the items for the subjugation class he'll have. He promises she'll be the first to know, and the woman blushes and says she'll hold him to that promise. The dean then asks if that's all for today, and the young man nods yes. She says they should leave because the staff will clean everything up, and he is very relieved. Suddenly, he feels dizzy and realizes he is completely out of energy. The young man then faints from exhaustion, and the dean catches him so he doesn't fall to the ground. She asks if he's okay, and with a smile he says yes, and that he just miscalculated his stamina. The woman offers to take him to the dormitory and asks if he's afraid of heights. The young man replies that he's not afraid of heights, with a mischievous smile on his face. At that, the dean picks him up in her arms like a princess, and he is shocked by the situation. With the young man in her arms, she jumps from the building's window with surprising strength. They fly through the sky, and the young man is surprised by the amount of power she has. The woman stares at him with a serious and focused look as they fly through the night sky. With a smile, he thinks things are turning out very differently from his past life. From a distance, Erica observes the scene in the night sky with a thoughtful expression. She wonders if the young man hasn't arrived yet, and says she needs to deliver that to the boss. On the academy's forum, students are commenting about the top freshman girl standing there for hours. They speculate that she's waiting for the top student from the Borsipa department as usual. Other students ask to delete the post, and the protagonist wonders what that is. He thinks that if it's something important, she'll look for him again at another time. Suddenly, the classroom door opens, and the new professor appears before the class. The man in the bandana introduces himself as Ricaros Miles, the new teacher for the tools class. He tells them to go to the training center, and that the last one to arrive will run 20 laps. The students panic at the sudden run and start running out of the classroom. The protagonist is confused and wonders if this wasn't supposed to be a theory class. He is pushed by the crowd, and a classmate yells for him to just run without thinking. The young man starts running but soon falls behind because of his low stamina. Panting, he arrives last, and the professor reminds him of the 20 laps he must run. With a sigh, he agrees and starts running the 20 laps around the training track. His stamina is at rock bottom, and he wonders if he'll be able to handle the class like this. At that, the professor calls the attention of the other students to finally begin the class. He explains that the class was theoretical but changed because of the fire sword hunts. These are the fire sword hunters who hunt blacksmiths to forge hero weapons. He remembers the case wasn't solved, and the professor says the only defense is the body. That's why in class, they will learn to understand tools and protect their own bodies. He says that today they will talk about swords, and the young man thinks he needs to be careful now. But for that to happen, he first needs to increase his endurance and stamina. He looks at the bracelet he made and thinks the item's performance is pretty solid. The item absorbs mana and increases weight, in addition to having a skill that manipulates gravity. His stats have gone up, and he promises he will make his body useful before the end of the year. Exhausted from so much running, the professor tells him to stop and come to where he is in the arena. Lying on the ground, the young man activates his bracelet's special ability called Ring of Explosion. The instructor is surprised to see that, contrary to what he expected, the young man is fine. With a smile, the professor hands him a sword and tells him to take a swing with the blade. He holds the sword and thinks it's hard to move because of the weight of his bracelet. The young man prepares for the strike and admits to himself that his technique isn't very good. In the arena, the instructor and the young man face each other with swords in hand, ready for the test. The young man then advances and wonders if he should use that as he attacks with the sword. Other students comment that he is slow, but that his fighting form seems decent. But the professor blocks the blow and realizes that his technique is actually excellent. He thinks the boy was too hasty and that it would be better to point out this mistake to him. With a glint in his golden eye, the young blacksmith focuses entirely on his attack. At that, The instructor is completely shocked by what he just felt in the blow. He has a vision where he is completely defeated by the young cadet's attack. Startled, the man's eyes widen, not believing what just happened. The young man's sword stops right in front of the instructor's neck, who is paralyzed. He then wonders if he was intimidated by a freshman to the point of having an illusion. With a drop of sweat on his face, the professor asks who he learned to fight from. The protagonist remembers an old man from his past who taught him a few things. He smiles sheepishly and thinks the man said he created the technique in 10 minutes. In his memories, the old man said he would pay him later and asked what the hurry was. He remembers the man offered a technique instead of money to teach him. Back in the present, the young man says he learned by watching heroes fight in videos. With a smile, the professor then asks if he wants to learn real swordsmanship. He says he will write a letter of recommendation, and the scene changes to that afternoon. The protagonist faces the situation with a drop of sweat running down his face. An old man yells at a blonde student, saying he has nothing to teach him. This is Ma Guangsu, a retired S-rank hero known as the Broken Sword. The young man is shocked to see that the drunk, gambling, addicted old man was a professor. He approaches and says he is a student with a recommendation from another professor. The old man is surprised, and the blonde guy introduces himself as the top student of the department. But no matter how much he looks at the young man, he doesn't seem to be anything special to the master. The man asks the blonde guy if he wants to learn that badly, and the young man nods. Then he points to the protagonist and says he'll only accept him if he beats the freshman. He says it will be a one-round fight and that the first to land a blow wins. With the decision made, the professor raises his arm to give the starting signal. He then lowers his arm, and the fight begins with the blonde guy advancing to attack. The protagonist holds his wooden sword calmly and waits for the right moment. The master realizes he has removed the tension and that the counter attack would be a grapple. With a confident look, the blonde young man extends his hand to try to grab his opponent. The professor hates people who play mind games before even really fighting, but the protagonist dodges the attack and prepares for his own move. He manages to grab his opponent, and the two enter a struggle of strength. The blonde guy is surprised by the young man's strength, who seems to have nothing special. However, he manages to knock the protagonist to the ground with a quick move. Already on the ground, the young blacksmith activates his bracelet's ability to turn the tables. The bracelet glows with a bluish energy and releases a wave of power all around. The blonde young man is thrown to the side and falls to the ground, not understanding what happened. The protagonist also falls and complains of pain from the impact of the fall. The blonde guy approaches and looks like he's going to finish the fight, but something is wrong with him. He then falls to the ground, completely exhausted and without the strength to continue the fight. With a smile, the young man asks if he wasn't a little faster than his opponent. The two lie on the ground while the professor observes the scene in silence. The master tells everyone to leave, and the young man reminds him that he promised to teach him if he won. The professor says that since he was hit by him, maybe the young man should teach him. He comments that the top student being defeated by a freshman seems like a pretty serious thing. The master decides he will at least make the blonde guy capable of fending for himself. The blonde young man is overjoyed to learn that he will get a training schedule. He thanks him and bows several times, but the professor tells him to get out of there. The protagonist stops him and says he has something to talk to the blonde guy about in private. The master ignores him and tells the young man to show him the technique he used against the other professor. With a focused look, the young man prepares to demonstrate his skill. He advances with the sword in a fast and precise movement towards the master. The blade stops millimeters from the professor's hand, who watches everything without moving. He says this is the technique of the first deadly blow that he developed on his own. The master says the concept is good, but the execution is poor and that it wouldn't work again. He says he would have broken the limbs of whoever taught him, and the young man smiles at the response. Then the master promises he will create a body suitable for the technique he uses. At that, the young man asks if he's already registered for the class, and the man confirms, a bit confused. With the confirmation, the young man bows as a sign of respect and thanks the professor. The master watches him and thinks that he is a very bold and straightforward young man. Already outside, the blonde guy runs to catch up with the protagonist, who was already leaving. Surprised, the blacksmith turns around and asks the young man why he hasn't left yet. He then hands him a black envelope and says he has something to give him as a gift. The young man realizes it's an invitation from Nobliss, and that Erica planned to give it to him. The blonde guy says there are annoying people there, but it would be a good chance for the protagonist. With a smile, he says that thanks to the young man, he was able to get into the master's class. The blacksmith then accepts the invitation and thanks his classmate for the gift. Walking, he thinks about the courses he's already signed up for and that he wants one next to Borsippa. The ones that come to his mind right away are curses, alchemy, and enchantment. Suddenly, someone grabs his wrist, and the young man turns to see who it is. His eyes widen in surprise when he sees the girl who stopped him in the middle of the path. A young woman with glasses stares at him and asks if he was the one who made that bracelet. He stares back at her and asks what would happen if he said yes, he was. She then asks if he wants her to enchant the item, and the system creates a bond. This is Lee Claudeau, a genius who created legendary armaments with enchantments. She is shocked to realize the item is rare, grade, and made with heavy ore. Sitting at the table, she analyzes the bracelet and thinks about how many formulas she can add. Desperate, she wonders what to do, and he questions if the armament isn't good. But she says the problem is that there are too many things to do with the item he made. There are so many formulas she can use that deciding which one is the best becomes difficult. He then says there's more, and the girl stares at him, completely confused by the news. The young man warns that there is a resonance phenomenon, and she gets even more excited. Suddenly, a young man glares at him and asks what his true identity is there. She is shocked to learn he is a first year and introduces herself as an upperclassman. The newcomer says he has something to talk about, asks the young man to follow him for a moment. The girl complains about the interruption, and the blacksmith wonders if he is Erica's subordinate. He tells the young man to say it right there, and that there's no need for all this mystery. The man then tells him to apologize to Erica for tearing her invitation, but the protagonist calmly replies that she was the one who told him to tear it. The subordinate thinks that makes sense, but that he received an invitation from someone else. The blacksmith sighs and asks if Erica was the one who sent him there for this. The young man denies it and says it was his own decision, but the upperclassman looks at him suspiciously. She calls him a liar and says everyone knows he is the young master's servant. Angered, the man clenches his fists in rage for being called a servant like that. He says the young man might be thinking he's special, but the truth is very different. The protagonist warns him that Babel is a place full of people much more amazing than him. The man just stares at him and replies that he understands what he's trying to say. The blacksmith asks if he is talking about himself, and the young man feels exposed. Furious, the subordinate yells at him to shut up and attacks him with a dark energy. The young man extends his hand to defend himself from the attack coming his way. A creature of dark energy appears, and he protects the girl from the surprise attack. He dispels the creature and realizes the attack was made using a dagger as a medium. The man is shocked and wonders how he managed to stop his attack like that. The protagonist holds the dagger and analyzes it with a serious and very focused look. With a smile, he says it was making a delicious sound and activates his ability. His eyes glow with a red energy, and he tastes the iron of the blade. The system shows his bond ability with Yunhe, which consumes iron to generate heat. He then activates the ring of explosion, and the two are thrown into the air instantly. The man takes a strong punch to the stomach and coughs from the impact of the blow. He falls to the ground and the protagonist lands safely with the girl shortly after. She calls him upperclassman, and he turns to the girl, who seems very excited. He then asks if she recommends any class from the enchantment department. The girl's eyes light up at the question, and she seems to think of a good answer. She recommends the ancient enchantment class and says there's an incredible upperclassman there. The guy who works for Erica is walking down the street, bummed out about losing so badly. Then, out of nowhere, a mysterious voice stops him and asks to take a look at the dagger from the fight. He turns around, completely shocked, and realizes it's Erica herself standing right in front of him. Without asking any questions, he hands the dagger over to the girl, who takes the item with a very serious look on her face. She tells him not to say anything about this to her brother, and that she'll talk to his family herself. The guy agrees, a bit confused, as she notices the dagger has an anti-theft spell on it. With this, she starts to wonder if the young man created a skill to nullify the weapon's magic. Meanwhile, in a classroom, our protagonist is looking at some daggers on a table. A system screen pops up, announcing that a friendship with Erica has been formed between them. The kid wonders if she saw him fighting her servant on the street a little while ago. He takes a look at the daggers and thinks he can make them better using black spirit thread. Just then, the professor starts his lecture, and the young man gets bored with the basic theory. The teacher says he's explained enough, and now they're all moving on to the practical part. He explains that the shape of metal can change a lot depending on how mana is used. Then he shows the class how the same metal can take on many different and wild forms. Because of this, he says a true blacksmith needs to understand the material they're using. The professor finishes by saying that the students need to master the potential of each metal. He then tells the class that today's lesson will be about deforming metals with ingots. An assistant starts handing out the ingots while the professor explains the day's task. The protagonist notices the teacher isn't against magitech forging and gives them 10 minutes for the task. The task begins, and one of the students quickly starts to panic because he can't control the metal properly. Other students also complain that the metal isn't returning to its normal state, and the professor just watches. But our protagonist and the blonde-haired boy manage to control the ingots without any difficulty. The two guys finish the first task at the same time and look at each other with confident expressions. With that, the professor says the two students can move on to the next phase of the test. He shows a new shape and tells the two of them to copy the arrangement appearing on the screen. The blonde guy smiles confidently, thinking he can beat the protagonist in both speed and quality. But the professor shows an even more difficult arrangement just to test the two students. The blonde boy manages to create the shape and feels like he's the best of them all with the final result. He shows his perfect creation to the class with a smile that says he thinks he's the greatest. The professor then calls the boy by his name and looks at him with a very serious expression. He asks the blonde guy to return the ingot to its normal shape, and the young man is completely confused. The young man tries but fails, realizing the mana arrangement is completely frozen. The teacher explains that the method he used was wrong from the start, and the blonde guy is shocked. He reminds the student that a blacksmith needs to have perfect mastery over the metal they are using. If the arrangement can't be restored, the equipment isn't just deformed, but completely corrupted. The blonde guy listens to the explanation in silence and says he'll pay much more attention next time. The protagonist watches the scene and wonders if the other guy figured out what the real test was. He then undoes his own creation with a very quick and precise movement of one of his hands. The ingot returns to a liquid form, and he says that was enough for now. The other students are left speechless by how easily he undid the difficult arrangement. Very surprised, the professor asks the protagonist to show him the deformation again. The young man smiles and thinks that he fooled the teacher, as he only managed it because of that specific ingot. The professor understands that the ingot was attuned, which is why it was possible to do all that. He thinks the young man didn't even realize the incredible thing he had just done. There's a legend about the greatest blacksmith of all time, who created a formula many decades ago. It was the equation of deformation, a super important challenge called the truth of iron. The teacher wonders if the young man broke the formula and thinks he would be the second person to do so. As the test ends, the sun is already setting outside the Babel Academy building. The class is over, and the professor asks the protagonist to stay behind because he wants to chat with him. The teacher gives him an entrance gift, a very rare vermilion flame jewel. He explains that if the young man absorbs the rare jewel, he can strengthen his flame forever. With a smile on his face, the young man thanks him and says it will be a huge help. Additionally, the professor asks if he's interested in taking the course that he himself teaches. The protagonist asks if he's talking about the fundamentals of the origins of various types of armaments. He confirms and says it's one of the few classes at Babel with a gigantic budget. At that, he thinks that he'd never heard of this professor before his return to the past. The young man then agrees to take the course, and the teacher asks if he can handle so many. But the young man calmly replies that, including this new one, it will only be 4 courses in total. The two then shake hands, and the system glows as a new friendship is formed. The affinity he got from the teacher creates a rare metal with wood-like characteristics. Back in his room, he thinks that if he can extract metal, he might also be able to forge a body. However, having too many types of mana in one's body can be very dangerous for a blacksmith like him. But he's different, and with his internal mana depleted, he prepares to absorb the jewel. With his body completely out of mana, he begins to draw in the essence of the red jewel's flame. His job as a blacksmith is to build a mana circuit just for this fire flame. The process begins, and he feels the energy coursing through his entire body all at once. A large red flame envelopes him, while a magical item floats right beside him. Then, with a very bright flash, he uses the energy to forge himself from the inside. The system announces that his elemental mana has been strengthened, and he has gained a new ability. He remembers a woman who taught him not to give up on using his own materials. She used to say with a smile that he'd be a fool not to take every chance he got. With that in mind, he thinks he needs to use everything at his disposal now. Whether it's a future partner or an enemy, he won't leave any room for regrets. The next day in another class, the professor announces they'll be adding the finishing touches to the project. He warns that what they produce today will set the course for the entire first semester. All the students shout in response and start working at their forges with great enthusiasm. The protagonist analyzes his sword and complains that his body can't keep up with his great skill, but he has no time to slack off and gets ready to continue his work at the forge. He then hammers the hot steel and plunges it into water to temper the sword's blade. With a sigh of relief, he looks at the sword and thinks it didn't turn out bad at all. He thinks he could make more swords, but wouldn't have time to finish the rest of the task. So he decides to forge a single piece, but with the greatest perfection he can achieve. The blade glows with a white light, and a strange sound begins to echo through the forge room. The young man turns to the window and hears a familiar sound that makes him super focused again. It's the sound of the world coming to an end, appearing as a great dark wave in the sky. He remembers that whenever he heard this sound, he was able to forge a true masterpiece. With the white light complete, he gains a new super rare epic grade fighting style. The high-quality sword has a white edge and a cut as sharp as a razor. He thinks that for a common iron sword, the result was more than enough. With a smile, he feels his old skills are slowly coming back to him. Meanwhile, the other students look at their own swords and feel very bad about them. On Saturday morning, he meets the upperclassman who invited him for a visit. She's surprised he wants to see her enchantments and guides him through the big city. He asks if the place isn't a bit far, and she jokes that it wouldn't be that easy. They arrive at a hardware store with a very old wooden sign out front. The girl opens the door and announces with great excitement that they've finally arrived. Then she shouts for her grandmother, and he watches her with a very curious look. A voice answers from inside the store, and a figure emerges from behind a pile of pots. A white-haired old woman appears and says calmly, that she's not the least bit deaf. The old woman asks if he's her granddaughter's boyfriend, and the girl angrily denies it right away. She introduces him as the top student, and the grandmother says that Babel is really going downhill. The woman introduces herself as Helena, and the young man says his real name is Lee Sehun. The granddaughter complains to her grandmother about how much work she has because of the freshman. Then the girl guides him to the workshop, located in the back of the hardware store. He observes the pots and pans and thinks that the old woman's skill is truly impressive, but the young man doesn't understand why she works in a hardware store with so much talent. The upperclassman shows him an enchantment palette and powders made from pure mana stones. He's amazed by the variety of colors and asks if her job is just restoration. The girl confirms with a smile and says he hit the nail on the head with his guess about her. She says this way she can practice as much as she wants without worrying about the cost of materials. With a brush in hand, she picks up some of the golden powder and concentrates to perform the enchantment. A glowing magic circle forms on the pot, and the object is completely restored. The protagonist watches and thinks that he only came here because she seemed to be in a crisis. He remembers how she was called a failure for losing the top spot to him, but now that he's seen her up close, he believes he knows both the cause and the cure for her problem. The young man thinks her ability to concentrate so completely is a very unique talent. Walking through the workshop, he looks around and analyzes the equipment in the place. Out of nowhere, he sees some stones that react with mana matrices and create special effects. Helena encourages him to use them, saying his hands must be itching to forge. She challenges him to take whatever he wants, but only if he's truly capable of handling it. With a smile, he accepts because he really wants to use a whetstone of that level. With a very focused look, he approaches the pile of tools to choose one. To everyone's surprise, he picks up a simple kitchen knife to work on. The old woman stares at him and asks in a mocking tone if he's really going to use that. He confirms and says the knife belongs to someone who knows very well how to use that item. The young man picks up the whetstone and thinks it will handle the weapon at its absolute limit. He then begins to sharpen the knife with very fast and precise movements. Helena watches him, shocked, and wonders if that young man is really just a freshman from the academy. Suddenly, the girl shouts that she's finished her work and holds the restored pot up in the air. She turns and asks her grandmother when she arrived, and the woman answers her. The protagonist says it seems she came looking for flaws, but ended up learning a lesson. Furious, Helena smacks her granddaughter on the head and tells the young man to shut up right now. He then hands the knife to the old woman and asks if she's done with all the drama. With a smile, he says it was the best he could do and that he'll do better next time. She then kicks both of them out of the workshop and tells them to get out of there that instant. The girl pulls him away and says her grandmother is just grumpy for no reason. Alone, Helena observes the perfectly sharpened knife he left on the counter. Suddenly, a man rushes in shouting and asks if his older sister is in the store's forge. She tells him to keep it down, and the man asks where his kitchen knife is. He complains that she should give up the restaurant, but the woman defends her hobbies. The man then finds the knife on the workshop counter and picks it up with his right hand. He examines it with a confused look, seemingly not understanding what had happened to it. He asks if she sharpened the knife while tipsy again, but Helena says it wasn't her this time. The woman then reveals it was a freshman, and the man is shocked by the big news. She repeats that a freshman who just entered the academy was the one who sharpened his knife. The man is speechless and wonders who on earth this mysterious kid is. Back at the academy, the protagonist asks about the old woman, and the girl starts to answer. He wants to know the story, but she says it's nothing special and that she's not really sure. She tells him that many professors have left the department over the last 10 years at the academy. She then asks what he thought of her enchantment, and the young man ends up praising her. But he says that although her fundamentals are perfect, she has a very closed mind. The girl is shocked, and he says she thought of a better method, but decided not to use it. He reminds her that a creator's imagination is a weapon and a talent in itself. Angrily, she says she doesn't do it because she doesn't know how, and that there's a good reason behind it. The young man then turns and says he has a schedule and can't give her his attention for long. The girl stares at him, completely confused, as he picks up a knife to demonstrate his point. He explains that making the stone is like casting, and carving the shape in water is enchanting. That's why enchantments have a dream, like quality and can't be easily contained. With a red glow, he uses the crimson lotus, and the knife's blade begins to shine. Then he activates the white light style, and the girl watches, completely fascinated by the scene. The enhancement isn't placed on the exterior, but rather beneath the surface of the weapon. He explains that if one layer isn't enough, you just divide the enchantment into multiple levels. With a swift movement, he throws the knife with all his might towards a stone pillar. The young man floats in the air as the knife flies with precision toward its main target. The blade pierces the stone with great ease, passing through it without even losing speed. A trail of light follows the path of the crimson lotus, leaving the girl in a state of shock. He says it's not a complete enchantment, but if it were done by her, it would work. She thinks that geniuses always find a way, even when they're very doubtful about something. Suddenly, she calls out to him and asks to borrow the knife for just a little while. The girl promises to finish and return it soon, and the young man ends up agreeing to her request. He says he doesn't mind, but if she's gonna take it, she should take the ingots too. Overjoyed, she thanks him and skips away with the new items in her hands. He watches her walk away and waves to her with a small smile on his calm face. The system extracts a bond from her, and the protagonist thinks about how good it is to be young again. In a giant courtyard, he reflects on the fight between the two great gods of light. But someone approaches, and he asks what the girl is doing there with him. She replies that she's following him, and he asks if she'll leave if he tells her to go. She says yes, but that she can watch him from a distance, and he sighs at her response. He then decides to go inside, and a white energy envelopes his entire body for a moment. The system shows the new bonds he has acquired with Erica and Lee Claudel. A voice announces the start of the ranked matches and welcomes everyone. The youngest professor, Ranfang, introduces herself as the one in charge of the live broadcast. She says they will now introduce the competitors, and a spotlight illuminates the arena. The first to be announced is the top student of ActionToon's 4th year and its future leader. She is the superhuman who broke records and has been #1 for 4 years in a row. In addition, she is the holy swordswoman who finally managed to clear the Tower of Heroes. With a confident look, the A-rank hero in Area Myers enters the Academy's combat arena. The protagonist and the girl watch as the crowd goes wild for the great champion. The first competitor to challenge her is the heir of the Flaming Wheels Ember Spear. With a smile on his face, the protagonist says that they've finally met again. The mad dog, Yem Sunga, enters the arena and faces the champion with a super fierce look. The fight begins, and the two advance with their weapons, glowing with a very intense energy. The spear and the sword clash, creating an explosion of sparks in the center of the arena. The young man spins his flaming spear and prepares for a new attack against the blonde girl. She defends herself with her sword and faces him with a very confident smile on her face. The young man is thrown back by the force of the impact and falls hard onto the arena floor. He groans in pain and gets up with difficulty to continue the fight against the champion. He then grips his spear tighter, and the weapon glows with a very intense fire. With a very focused look, the girl prepares for her opponent's next attack. The girl creates a circle of fire and braces for the attack coming her way. He jumps and attempts an aerial strike, but she defends with ease and knocks him down again. The protagonist watches the fight and thinks that his level is far below what was expected. He realizes that the young man's biggest problem is the weapon he's using in that combat. But in a swift move, the young man manages to disarm the girl and suddenly turns the tables. The tip of the spear stops millimeters from her neck, and it looks like he has won the fight. With a serious look, he faces her and waits for his opponent to surrender, but he is surprised and says that he lost the fight to the great champion of Babel Academy. The girl says it was a good match, and the referee announces the end of the combat. The winner is Aria Myers, and the crowd goes wild with another victory for her. The announcer mentions an interview, but the young man had to leave a little early. The girl laughs and says that fighting the 9th ranked competitor would be difficult even for her. She then decides to fill the time with a question and answer session with the audience. The protagonist watches the young man leave the arena and thinks he's pretty upset about the loss. The girl asks if he's leaving already, and the young man says he doesn't like her style. He turns around and says she's too full of herself, and the young woman stares at him, not understanding. She wonders why he's so irritated, but feels relieved on the other hand. Suddenly, she remembers what her brother said about a very interesting freshman at the academy. The champion watches the young man from a distance and seems to have found someone quite interesting. With his reflection in her eyes, she thinks she might have found this so-called freshman in a park near the martial arts hall. The young man meditates to calm himself down. The protagonist watches him from a distance and thinks that Yeom Sunga is alive and breathing well. He remembers that the young man made the ultimate sacrifice to defeat one of the 6 great evil gods. With a smile, he thinks he might be able to get his karma stone peacefully. The young man turns and realizes he has been followed by a very mysterious person. He is then surprised to see that it's Borsippa's top cadet who was following him. The protagonist smiles and says he just wanted to talk a bit, but the young man reacts very badly. Without a second thought, he tells the young man to get out of there and turns to leave the park. The young man walks away and says he hates the weak and that it won't be a bad deal for him. He continues, saying he doesn't want to talk to anyone, and asks the young man to leave quickly. The protagonist calls him a blacksmith, and the young man turns with a very confused look on his face. With a smile, he thinks that compared to his Mad Dog days, he's a total saint. He realizes this can't be solved with words and prepares to start a fight. The young man realizes the other won't back down and faces him with a very challenging look. The protagonist approaches and warns that he has only one thing to say to him right now. He confidently declares that the history of the fire wheel spear will end with him. Furious, the young man lunges with a punch, but the other stops him with a swift movement. He clenches his fist and prepares for a counter attack with a red energy. The protagonist blocks the punch, and his bracelet glows with a very intense blue light. The seal of karma is activated, and a blast of energy sends the young man flying far away. Shocked, he wonders how the young man managed to stop a punch using only his pure mana. He realizes the young man lives up to his title and might be qualified to speak. The young man notices the mana trajectory is still around, and that this is the real power. He says it all ends here and prepares for the final blow against the protagonist. The young man launches a blast of fire, and the other prepares to defend against the attack. He is enveloped in white smoke, and the attack seems to have been very successful. With a sigh, the protagonist emerges from the smoke without a single scratch and faces him again. The young man is shocked because the ember should only react to his own fire mana. His eyes widen in surprise as he sees the energy surrounding the protagonist's body. With a confident smile, the young man faces him and prepares for his next move. With a smile, he realizes his opponent is about to lose control of himself. The young man is enveloped in a purple aura and prepares to attack with his full strength. Our protagonist remembers that the huge conflict in the Manhwa sect happened precisely because of this. The young man lunges with a punch, but the protagonist stops him with a super fast move. The two exchange blows, and the young man feels that the effect of the Iron Seeker is wearing off. He realizes he has no choice but to overwhelm his opponent to win the fight. An explosion of light occurs, and the two are pushed apart by the impact of the strong blow. But suddenly, someone grabs the protagonist's hand, interrupting their fight. The blonde guy arrives, and the young man wonders if that guy is really Jake Myers. He asks if the blonde guy knows Borsippa's top cadet, and his friend confirms that he does. The spear hair stares at him in silence, looking quite annoyed by the interruption. He tells the guy to leave, and the blonde drags the protagonist away from that place. The young man tells him to stop saying weird things, and to hurry up and get out of there. Alone, the young man reflects that he lost his patience and almost tarnished his master's honor. He clenches his fists in anger, regretting having lost control like that. The blonde guy scolds him for picking a fight and says he could have gotten himself taken out. With a smile, the protagonist says he wasn't going to get taken out, and the blonde guy is confused. He explains that he was just intimidating the guy, and the system creates a bond with the young man. He thinks that now he needs to increase the bond level to extract the guy's karma. His friend asks if he hurt his hand, and the protagonist looks at his injury. The blonde guy says it's fine, and that his hand is tougher than the rest of his body. The protagonist looks at him and says that the most important thing isn't his super tough hand. He asks what the blonde guy said about his sister in the arena, and his friend confirms it's her. The young man says she's a pain, and the blonde guy is shocked by his friend's nerve. He then says that she has taken an interest in the protagonist, and an image of her appears behind him. The girl overheard his comments in the crowd, and the blonde guy starts to panic. The protagonist smiles and says her interest is exactly what he's always wanted. The blonde guy warns him not to take her lightly, because she is a very dangerous person. He then asks if the girl is petty and treacherous, and his friend is terrified. The blonde guy says he wouldn't go that far and looks around, afraid of being overheard by her. The young man then asks why he dislikes his own older sister so much. He remembers the legend of the sword Saint Area Myers, who used a super, sacred weapon. On a battlefield, she looked at her sword with an expression of disappointment. One day, she disappeared, and in her place appeared the demon god of annihilating light. With a smile, the protagonist says she gives him a bad vibe just by looking at her face. He then says goodbye to his friend and leaves, leaving the blonde guy alone in the middle of the street. The young man wonders what happened and why the protagonist was acting so strange. Suddenly, his phone rings, and he answers the call with an expression of pure fear. It's his sister, Area Myers, telling him to tell her everything about his interesting new friend. The young man is shocked by his sister's request and doesn't know what to do next. Her voice echoes in his mind, reminding him that his little sister is asking for a favor. He turns and runs down the street, afraid of what might happen to him now. The next morning in the classroom, the protagonist feels tired from the previous day's fight. Suddenly, a small man in a wheelchair enters the room, shouting for everyone's attention. He introduces himself as Reese Doba and says he'll be teaching the attribute casting class. The professor is famous for being a Madian, and all the students are very impressed. He says that before they start, he has something to give to all the students in the class. The blonde guy wonders how much the protagonist will receive and hopes to get 3 times more. The professor informs the young man that his budget hasn't been released yet, and he is shocked. He explains that the quality of his work was so high that the sword was sent to an auction. With this, he thinks the vice principal is trying to sabotage him on purpose, but he concludes that if it were a real problem, Professor Kim would have done something. The professor announces that today's class will be on residual mana, and a cadet will be assisting. To everyone's surprise, the assistant is Yeom Sunga, a third-year upperclassman. A classmate is shocked to see the upperclassman, and the professor says he should focus on his studies. The teacher says that's enough talk, and that before the practical part, they will go over the concepts. The professor explains that in weapon creation, mana is divided into charged and independent types. Both types have their advantages, but the independent type is much harder to construct. Therefore, everyone will start with the charged type, and the teacher calls his assistant. The upperclassman then concentrates fire mana in his hand, preparing to demonstrate the technique. It is explained that fire mana is unstable, but if controlled, it can last for a long time. This is the technique the assistant is demonstrating, the Flaming Wheels Ember Spear. The blonde friend is impressed with the control, while the classmate next to him can barely manage the furnace. The teacher advises them to take this opportunity and to turn in their assignment by next Thursday. The theme of the assignment is to create whatever they want, but within the flaming wheel with charged mana. He then sends everyone to the casting room and reminds them not to forget to change their clothes. The protagonist stares at the upperclassman and thinks this is his big chance to get closer to him. Another student seizes the golden opportunity to try to talk to the upperclassman Yeom Sunga. The young man introduces himself, but the upperclassman tells him to get lost, leaving the student devastated. The boy feels like complete trash for being dismissed in such a cold way. The spearhair seems to not care about the situation and maintains his serious expression. At that moment, he sees the protagonist leaving and calls him by his name, Lee Soo-hoon, with a look. The upperclassman then asks him what he really knows about him. The young man says he heard that spear mastery is defined by the number of fire wheels. He continues, saying he saw the spearhair handle 3 and that he could maintain 6. The upperclassman follows him and asks where he's going with this nonsensical conversation. The protagonist then claims that he has already reached the 7th wheel, leaving the young man shocked. But one day, he could no longer maintain it, and the young man wonders how he knows the secret. The young man explains that he has some talent with fire and felt something strange when he saw the flames. It's as if he couldn't release his power and was letting it slowly fade away. The young man becomes interested and asks if the protagonist knows the cause of that problem. The spearhair replies that he has a hunch about what might be happening, but he puts on a mocking expression and says he has no desire to share his hunch. The young man then asks him to state what he wants in exchange for his help in solving the problem. His first condition is that the upperclassman pays a fair price for all his advice. The second is that if he faces a difficult decision, he must consult the protagonist. He then gives him an ultimatum, telling the young man to decide before they reach the casting room. The upperclassman thinks for a moment, and with a displeased look, finally agrees. The young man accepts if the protagonist shows him proof, and the other smiles with great confidence. Later that day in the forge room, the two prepare for the challenge. The upperclassman wonders if the young man is going to forge without even having a blueprint or a plan. He then starts by mixing fire and dark ore in a 7:3 ratio. The young man doesn't understand why, because if he throws it all in, the elemental mana will vanish instantly. The instruction in his mind is to apply heat until the elemental mana starts to leak out. Then he prepares for the next step of the process, tightly wrapping the bands around his wrist. By adjusting the flames in mana, he makes the metal absorb the elemental mana at the same time. The professor observes and realizes he's already using thermal displacement, which is why it went to auction. He thinks that to others it looks like thermal displacement, but Yam sees something different. The upperclassman watches every move attentively, because something very unusual is happening. The young man then steps on the bellows to increase the flames, strength, and continue the process. He then keeps the fire mana on the outside and the dark mana on the inside in a perfect circle. With this, the upperclassmen and the professor watch the process, and the spear heir understands. He remembers his second attribute, mana, which was forbidden because it interfered with his spear. The young man realizes that by using this mana, he dropped to the 5th wheel and is in shock. The protagonist completes the 5 wheels of black flame and says they are stronger than 7. The upperclassman then reveals that the Yaomawa sect sends an instructor to check on his skills, and if he's below the 6th wheel, he will lose his successor status immediately. The young man suggests he do it the old-fashioned way, but the upperclassman says it won't work. At that moment, the young man's mana explodes, and he reveals he can no longer control the dark attribute. The protagonist then asks when the instructor arrives, and the upperclassman replies that it's tomorrow. The young man thinks that losing his status would lead to his expulsion and wonders if there's a method. Suddenly, he grabs the spearhair by the collar with a very serious look on his face, and he asks if he is willing to do anything to protect his position, and the young man agrees. The protagonist smiles confidently because the deal between them is finally sealed. He then opens a screen and says that to start, They will change the upperclassman's weapon. The two arrive at the private training room, and the young man calls the hair a show-off. But the protagonist goes to a panel and says he can change the appearance of the place with a touch. Then the room's scenery suddenly transforms into a place called the Manhwa sect. The young man asks if he's homesick, and the other says his master sent it. The protagonist then says they will start by creating the training tool for the spear. He takes a small red sphere and starts working on it with his fire mana. An information screen appears, describing the Crimson Resonance Blackstone for him. He then places the sphere on the tip of the young man's spear and says he's ready for training. The upperclassman now holds 2 spears and finds it strange, but the young man says it's better this way. He then tells the young man to create a fire wheel with his left hand and release the mana in his right. The upperclassman takes a deep breath and concentrates to try to follow his new master's orders. With a swift movement, he spins the spear and manages to create a perfect fire wheel. But suddenly, his left hand explodes in a wave of energy, and the young man is shocked. He asks what that was, and the young man explains that the dark mana flowed to the wrong hand. The protagonist says the interference is because the upperclassman has been suppressing his mana for too long. He assures him that with training, the 6th wheel will be easy and hands him an item to use. The upperclassman admires the new equipment and says the protagonist has high-quality things. 3 hours later, the young man is already training with mastery, using both manas at the same time. The young man watches and is impressed by his quick adaptation to the new training method. He then analyzes every movement of the upperclassman, from his muscles to his center of gravity, and even the wave of mana that circulates through his body and is released at the tip of the spear. The young man realizes he's being watched, and the protagonist says he's collecting data. He then explains that he needs this information to build the upperclassman's new weapon. The young man says the weapon is for an assignment, so he shouldn't get his hopes up too high. The protagonist then changes the subject and asks the spearhead a serious question. He asks if there's a special reason why he wants to keep his position so badly. The young man replies that his master wishes for him to become the next leader of the great sect. He says he was adopted by the S-rank hero, and as a disciple, he only follows his will. A portrait of Master Yelm Jin Haiyan appears, showing our upperclassman's adoptive father. The story explains that the master has retired, but his influence over the young man is absolute. With this, the bond level between the two rises to 3, and the young man smiles at the scene. The spearhead then looks at him and asks why he is helping him so much. The protagonist thinks for a moment before answering with a serious and mysterious expression, and then a vision of the 6 great demonic realms suddenly appears in his mind. He reveals that he plans to enter all of them and needs people to protect him on the journey. The protagonist says that the sect leader needs skill and money, and the young man calls himself serving. The young man asks if he was expecting charity, since they barely know each other. The spearhead then asks if he wants a price for his great help, and he proposes that if the young man helps him become the leader, he will follow him into the 6 demonic realms. The protagonist seems to consider the proposal with a very serious and calculating look. He tells the upperclassman to make the weapon, and in return, he will take care of the demon gods for him. With that, the young man smiles because he has finally gotten what he wanted from the very beginning. The young man asks if he won't regret his decision and holds the stone in his hand. Then, a demonic aura envelopes him, and he says he will make him the leader even if he doesn't want to be. The next day at the public training ground, they prepare for the big test. A man introduces himself as Kang Hyan Woon, the instructor from the Manhwa sect, and greets him. The instructor explains that the disciples there were chosen to fight and gain experience. Kang then praises the young man and says he is the most promising candidate for the position. But the upperclassman says nothing is decided and tells the master to be careful with his words. The instructor smiles and apologizes, saying he spoke out of turn. He then asks if they can begin the skills assessment, but the young man immediately refuses. The spearhead declares he will apply for the 7th wheel, and the master is shocked. The instructor remembers his master's order to act, without thinking, if the young man did this. He warns that a master is required, and that it's too soon, but the young man tells him to shut up. The young man asks if he's afraid of losing his position, and the furious instructor demands his spear. The duel of dominance is a test of power where the stronger one wins, and a tie results in a promotion. Then the upperclassman prepares for combat, using his 2 red, glowing spears. Master Kang mocks the young man's double-bladed weapon, calling it a crude weapon. The young man lunges with a surprise attack, and the instructor is shocked by his speed. Kang complains that his chaotic flames do not qualify him to take today's test. But the young man says with a smile that he'll find out when they actually fight. The instructor warns him that he will regret it and prepares for his counter-attack. The two clash in an explosion of fire and sparks that illuminates the entire training ground. The power of the 2 spears collides, creating an overwhelming wave of energy. Master Kang watches the scene with a look of pure disbelief in his frightened eyes. He shouts in panic as his flame dragon is being destroyed by the young man's power. Kang looks at his spear with an expression of astonishment and can't believe what he sees. The blade of his weapon begins to crack under the pressure of the strong upperclassman's attack. Defeated, the instructor falls to his knees on the ground with his broken spear beside him. The young man looks at him and says that his technique was the crude one after all. The protagonist asks what the next step is, and the upperclassman says he will be recognized as the successor. The young man then asks how people become leaders, and the spear hair explains everything. First, one must reach 8 wheels, and then gain the approval of many masters. The young man says the approval won't be a problem, but it won't be as easy as today. The protagonist assures him it won't take long, and the upperclassman thinks he makes it sound easy. The young man warns him to worry about how he's going to pay for all this help later. The young man says he can get money or materials within reason for the payment, but the protagonist reveals he has one more request, and the upperclassman is surprised by the news. The spear hair thinks the weapon is good, but it's just a temporary class assignment. He wonders what kind of spear the young man will make next if this was done in just a few hours. The young man asks for something more practical next time, and the affinity between them rises to level 2. A screen explains that an affinity stone is generated with each exchange made with the target. The scene then shifts to an auction house, filled with people waiting for the event to begin. The auctioneer thanks everyone and starts the regular auction for the second-year students. Professor Kim notices the large crowd and thinks that being the top student makes a difference. Professor Kim thinks that with so many people watching, it will be difficult for others to go against it. The auction's theme is iron swords, with 36 pieces and a special inspection. A golden silk fabric is revealed, made from the fur of a white tiger, soft yet resilient. Because of this resilience, the auctioneer strikes an item to show how the test will be conducted. Upon impact, the blade shatters into pieces, showing how weak that metal was. The auctioneer then announces that the golden silk will be used to find all the bad items. With that, the first item to be tested is the blade of a cadet named Joseph, who is present. The protagonist says this is going to be interesting, and the girl next to him asks why he's doing this. He explains that the white tiger's fur weakens the durability of any weapon it touches. The girl then asks if the white light sword is at a disadvantage because it focuses on cutting power. He agrees and says this is an obvious setup to target him and Professor Kim. But the young man says that will only happen if the weapon isn't well made and another sword is sold. Finally, it's the turn of the white light sword made by our great protagonist. The white light sword is then tested and strikes the golden silk fabric head on. To everyone's surprise, the blade glows and cuts through the fabric with incredible ease. With a single strike, the fabric that was supposed to be super resilient is cut into 2 pieces. The vice principal is completely shocked and doesn't understand what just happened on stage. The sword remains completely intact on the stage, glowing with an impressive aura of power. The vice principal is in total shock and wonders what just happened. At that moment, the protagonist gets up from his chair and walks towards the auction stage. He then offers to explain the situation, and the crowd recognizes him as Lee Sehun. The explanation goes that a sword focused on cutting power should break when hitting the special fabric, but his sword gathered mana from the air and compressed it into the blade like a razor. One of the students in the audience wonders about the mana, because he can't feel anything. With a smile, the young man says it's normal not to feel the energy because it's very subtle. He explains that the density isn't high enough to be an aura, but it's more than light, and they call it sharpness. At this, the girl in the kimono asks if what happened was because of this sharpness. The protagonist confirms and says that identical forms of sharpness resonate instead of canceling each other out. He then shows a crystal and says that by using it, he can do something very interesting. A screen reveals that the item is Erika's binding stone, and he activates it immediately. With the stone's power, the sword's unstable mana flow finally stabilizes. The young man says he now just needs to create a clear path and touches the sword to the fabric. A close-up shows the exact moment the reinforced blade touches the material on the stage. With the mana stabilized, the sword shines brightly and releases an overwhelming power. The item is upgraded and becomes a rare, rank weapon with a completely new ability. The young man says the sword has gained a new skill and has leveled up from advanced to super rare rank. He then asks the shocked auctioneer to change the starting bid because of the new rank. The auctioneer adjusts the starting bid from 1 million to 5 million won on the spot. Since it's an improved item from the top cadet, everyone in the audience prepares to bid. The bids quickly rise to 10, 30, and even 100 million won. A blonde-haired young man shouts a bid of 200 million and is shocked by the amount he just said. But the girl in the kimono calmly offers 210 million for the protagonist's sword. The auctioneer gets excited and tries to encourage more bids to increase the sword's value. The bids reach 310 million, and the protagonist thinks about the wealthy. Suddenly, a voice from the back of the room offers 600 million for the guy's sword. The blonde-haired young man remembers his sister telling him to buy the weapon at any cost. But seeing that it was his sister who made the bid, he realizes she was telling him to stop. The young man gives up and laments, knowing his sister will tear into him later at home. The vice principal watches everything, sweating bullets, and completely defeated by the situation. With that, the auctioneer announces that the sword has been sold for 600 million won. Professor Kim watches the scene with an expression of satisfaction and great pride in his student. The protagonist smiles, impressed with the money he made from selling his sword. He then checks his phone and confirms the deposit of 600 million into his account. Later, the sword's buyer asks if he confirmed the deposit, and he says yes. She questions him on how he plans to use the sword, and he says he's going to test it in a zone. The woman agrees, saying it would be a waste to use an item of this level just for training. She then suggests Mount Enwell as a destination, which is a training ground for freshmen. The woman explains that visiting the place in advance could be very useful for the young man, but she says that due to her position, going there would be a bit difficult for her. She then proposes a deal. He takes her there, and in return, she lets him create a weapon for her. The young man agrees to the proposal, but thinks this is all just an excuse from her. He remembers Jurgen Kruger, a powerful necromancer and president of a large company. It turns out that one of his lost artifacts is hidden on Mount Unwell, and that's what he wants. Elsewhere, the blonde-haired young man is standing in front of his sister, waiting for a scolding. She looks at him with a smile and says that in the end, he failed to get the weapon. He apologizes, and she tells him to forget it, because now they need to think about the next step. She then asks if he and the protagonist are in the same class and tells him to ask for a favor. The girl promises that if he gets what she wants, she will talk to their father about him. She warns that at this rate, he will lose his position as top cadet very soon. He remains silent, but she says he was already expecting this to some extent, right? The young man complains that their father forbade it until graduation, but agrees to do what she asks. With a determined look, he swears he will get the protagonist's sword no matter what. But she reprimands him and asks if it's right to interrupt his older sister like that. With a satisfied smile, she just tells him to bring her the weapon she wants so badly, and she emphasizes that he must get the item using whatever means necessary. Elsewhere, the protagonist and the girl in the kimono are talking about the blonde guy's sister. The girl says the protagonist is irritating her in a very strange and weird way. The scene changes, and the protagonist hands in his assignment, which are 2 spears, to the upperclassman. A screen reveals the stats of the 2 weapons, the Crimson Spear and the Spear of 10 Darknesses. A dwarf in a top hat praises the work, but says what stands out most are the formulas. He explains that the spears repel mana to warn when the execution of a strike fails. The evaluator says the weapons are good enough to serve as both a tool and a book. With that, he gives the young man a perfect score and exempts him from classes, and the young man thanks him. The other students are shocked, and one of them complains about being in the same class as a genius. The upperclassman tells him to take the spears and to let him know if he wants to sell both weapons. The young man then walks through the academy, thinking about the next class he has soon. Upon opening the training room door, he finds the blonde-haired young man training alone. The blonde guy is startled, and the protagonist says he arrived early to train a bit too. The young man says he's going to leave, but the other stops him and asks him to wait just a moment. With a smile, the blonde guy approaches and asks if he can ask for a big favor. But the protagonist refuses on the spot, and the young man is shocked by his friend's negative response. He says it's obvious his sister sent him to get a weapon and tells him to give up already. The young man thinks he can't disappoint Arya because she mustn't lose interest in him. The blonde-haired young man then takes something from his backpack and makes a new proposal. He shows a hero, rank Black Flame Hammer, with the attribute Convergence skill. The protagonist analyzes the item and says that although it's not bad, it can be improved. The blonde guy then proposes a duel, betting the hammer in exchange for a weapon for his sister. The protagonist thinks about the proposal with a very serious and analytical look. He then smiles and says he will add one more condition to their agreement. If he wins, the blonde guy and his sister are not allowed to talk to him for a whole month. The blonde guy accepts and prepares for the fight, thinking he won't be caught off guard. He decides to go all out from the start and concentrates a large amount of pure mana. The young man compresses the energy into his fists, preparing for a very powerful attack. Seeing this, the protagonist grabs an item to prepare for the combat as well. A screen shows that he deactivates Erika's seal and activates Ryu Yunha's in its place. With the new seal active, he grips his spear more firmly and prepares to fight. The young man faces his opponent and gets ready for the start of their fight. The blonde guy wonders how he can use so many weapons so naturally, but the young man is confident and says it won't be so easy to defeat him this time. He then lunges with an aerial attack, and their powers clash forcefully in the air. The protagonist meets the attack with a focused gaze and prepares for a counterattack. With a confident smile, the blonde guy shouts that victory this time is all his, but the protagonist dodges the blow and uses his spear to hit the blonde young man dead on. The young man is completely shocked, not understanding what just happened in the air. With the help of the spear hair, he uses the Wheel of Flames technique to win. A memory shows that he learned this from the 3 dogs to increase their band, but when they trusted the young man, they taught him their secret techniques. He remembers that in the beginning, they always said he had no talent for the techniques. The protagonist holds the flaming spear and thinks that at least now he can imitate the technique. With a swift movement, he spins the spear and hits the blonde young man squarely, knocking him down. The blonde young man is shocked, realizing he's lost control of his mana and is being dragged along, but his opponent notices that the protagonist's physical strength at the moment is just a skill boost. The blonde guy then plans to aim for the opening when the technique ends to turn the fight around. With that, he leaps away, narrowly avoiding his adversary's fire attack. The hero smiles, realizing his opponent understood the advantage of prolonging the fight, so he uses a dark ore and thinks about how he's using the mana stored in his ring. The young man is astonished to see him using fire mana, as he thinks that would be self-destructive. A blast of dark energy rains down on the blonde, who raises a shield to defend himself. The young man quickly joins his hands, creating a strong barrier of light to contain the impact. With great effort, he releases a defensive skill from his sword style in mid-air. At that moment, a blue pillar descends from the sky, and the protagonist watches the technique from a distance. He finds it very interesting that the blonde can use a sword technique with his bare hands. But since he can't lose, the hero prepares a flame attack under the light of a moon. The red and black attack completely pierces the blue light barrier, creating a shockwave. The force of the impact is so great that it illuminates the entire gym, destroying the floor. Next, the protagonist calmly walks through the smoke, enveloped in a blue aura. The young man gulps as he sees his opponent's red spear stopped at his neck. With victory secured, the young man relaxes his posture and dissipates the energy from his hands. The blonde admits defeat, and a notification appears, confirming a new bond has been formed. The hero asks if he wants to consider it a draw so he doesn't look bad, but the young man takes the hammer and says that since the final blow would have been fatal, he lost. The defeated one hangs his head in frustration, lamenting that if he could have used a sword, he would have. The protagonist questions this, and the blonde explains that whenever he uses a sword, it breaks. He reveals that he has even broken weapons with hero rank durability. Intrigued by the story, the blacksmith approaches and asks the young man to extend his hand. The blonde complies with the request, and the protagonist tells him to relax and not move his mana. Suddenly, the blacksmith raises the huge black hammer, and the young man panics and asks what he's doing. Without hesitation, he strikes the young man's hand with the hammer, causing an immediate flash of light. The protagonist observes the energy flowing and realizes exactly what the problem was. He notices that the young man's body wasn't reinforcing the weapon, but rather altering the material. The blonde yanks his hand back angrily and complains that he should have given a warning before doing something crazy. However, he is shocked when the protagonist asks if he wants a sword for himself. Just then, a blue crystal appears on the screen, showing that the young man's stone item has been extracted. With a confident smile, the blacksmith guarantees he will create a weapon that not even he can break. But suddenly, the young man looks to the side, sensing a suspicious presence arriving. A shadowy man arrives at the gym door, and the system announces that a bond has been formed. The mysterious man focuses his gaze on the blacksmith and tells the blonde to leave so they can talk alone. The young man obeys, somewhat confused, and leaves the two alone in the room as the door closes. The man says he looked like a blacksmith and now a spearman, and asks what he is. With his arms crossed, he warns the young man to be careful with his answer to avoid trouble. The protagonist is not intimidated and concludes that his posture was so good it impressed the master. He then shows a cluster of crystals and explains that it's a trick of his skill. The young man reveals that he just adjusts his own muscles to imitate someone's body, and to prove it, he deactivates the technique, showing that the entire aura vanishes as soon as the effect wears off. The master's eyes widen, and he brings a hand to his chin. Very surprised by the revelation, he asks about the downsides, and the young man says the process puts too much strain on his body. The man then turns his back and starts muttering to himself about this observation skill. He apologizes for his attitude, and the hero realizes he was thinking of a demon. The story tells of a being called a doppelganger that copies the martial arts of its opponents. Because of this, the kneeling master developed a great grudge against this technique, stealing demon. We then see the man's face with a huge scar over his eye, filled with the rage of his past. The young man then realizes that the master suspected him of being the demon or thought he could be. Therefore, the hero understands he was considered useful to help track this threat. The old man laughs loudly and agrees, saying that in his place, he would have thought the same thing. He complains with a laugh that heroes today have no sense when it comes to demons. But he quickly becomes serious and warns that he will need to change his teaching method after seeing the skill. The blacksmith nods in agreement and says goodbye, while the old man thinks about the boy's talent. The professor watches the student leave and concludes that despite his humble past, he is worthy. As he walks through the illuminated hallways, the young man reflects on the new bond he has formed. He then takes out his phone and calls the spearhead, who asks why he's in such a hurry. The hero replies that he hates to be kept waiting for payment, and his friend says he lives a charmed life. Ignoring the joke, he asks if the upperclassman knows a mage named Louise Valent. His colleague says he doesn't know the girl, and the young man just tells him to find out where she is. The hero is offended, thinking the young man is underestimating his contacts and influence. But the blacksmith coldly replies that his friend is still a nobody in his sect. The upperclassman hangs up, saying he has his methods, and the protagonist wonders what they will be. The memory reveals that Louise Valent was known as a ticking time bomb who caused a lot of trouble. However, he knows she only became aggressive after an accident and plans to act before it happens. Surprisingly, the upperclassman calls back very quickly, informing him that he has already found the girl. The document shows that she was a promising cadet and ranked second in magic. The story explains that her wand exploded in a duel, causing permanent damage. At this, the young man reacts with surprise upon seeing the whole complicated situation involving her past. The report states that she is undergoing rehabilitation at a general hospital, but has shown no improvement. Suddenly, the defeated blonde from before appears, excited to see that the protagonist is still there. The young man approaches, saying he wanted to finish talking about the promise to make a weapon. Without wasting time, the hero turns his phone screen and asks if his colleague knows the two names. The blonde confirms and explains that the two noble families are united by marriage and participate in events. With that, the blacksmith tells him investigate the two to earn the weapon, but the blonde is shocked. Excited, the young man promises to do anything if he really gets an unbreakable weapon. Seizing the opportunity, the protagonist asks with a wicked smile for his colleague to break his arm. He demands the fracture to be as clean as possible, startling the blonde with the request. The scene cuts to the large and modern general hospital under a blue and very sunny sky. Inside, we see some doctors with very serious expressions evaluating a patient's condition. The gray-haired mage appears, breathing with difficulty and clutching her own chest. Despite the pain, she raises her hand with a sharp gaze, announcing she will begin the 100th attempt. Next, a strong fire aura surrounds her as the girl prepares herself, but at the same moment, she feels a sharp pain in her neck, and her teeth grind. The pain is unbearable, causing the girl to bend forward as she loses her concentration. The doctors observe everything and coldly note that there was a mana backflow in the young woman. At this, the girl panics, remembering the day of the accident, and begs for the pain to stop. The lead doctor orders an immediate halt to the test and tells the team to bring neutralizers. Trembling, the patient extends her hand and says she's fine, asking for just a quick rest. However, the doctor coldly refuses and informs her that today's session is over for her safety. To make matters worse, he informs her that her magic will be downgraded to the beginner level, shocking her. Desperate, she tries to take a step forward, calling out to the professor and begging him. The nurse holds her from behind while the mage screams, pleading for one more chance. Ignoring the medical warnings not to strain her energy, the girl yells angrily that she can do it. Completely beside herself, the young woman breaks free with a push and lunges forward with her eyes glowing. But the impact of the explosion throws her violently backward, slamming her body into the wall. With that, the room fills with smoke, and the girl falls unconscious onto the hospital floor. Later, she slowly wakes up and opens her eyes, still very dazed. Frustrated, the young woman curses quietly as she realizes she is lying in a hospital bed. With one hand on her forehead, she acknowledges her mistake in rushing her training so much. Then Louise gets up angrily, telling herself she needs solutions, not pity. The young woman decides to take a short walk, muttering that she'll do some exercises and meditation to calm down. but suddenly, she bumps into something hard and lets out a groan of pain from the impact. She complains, cursing the idiot who walks around with their eyes closed in the hallway while rubbing her head. However, she is surprised to see the protagonist with his face very close, staring at her intently. Suddenly, air raid sirens blare loudly with red lights flashing everywhere. A loud explosion is heard, and the ground shakes as smoke fills the area in seconds. The blacksmith wipes his face and coughs, saying he was almost crushed by the attack. He runs desperately, cursing the darn hospital staff, with whom he will never work again. Along the way, he finds the mage wearing a gas mask while walking calmly. The girl takes an incredible leap forward, landing on the ground with agility even after the attack. He watches her, impressed, wondering who could be behind that terrible attack. However, while he was thinking, Lee surprisingly passes by him, bumping his shoulder. But she quickly turns her head with a very intimidating look, asking what he was looking at. The hero plays dumb, but she repeats the question even more seriously, demanding an answer. The mage yells at him, telling him to apologize for the bump, since he doesn't watch where he's going. She gives him a death glare, her eyes glowing intensely with a frightening blue. Out of patience, the young man trips her to the ground with a quick move, using just one of his legs. The protagonist stares at her coldly, saying that if she's injured, she should be lying down. He offers to help her back to her room, but she sharply refuses his help. Annoyed, Luis thinks that if she gets caught, the doctors will lock her in her room all day. With quick steps, the two walk down the hospital corridor side by side and in silence. Upon reaching the room, the blacksmith asks if the patient needs anything. The mage coughs a little and asks him to get a small black box from the dresser drawer. The young man obeys and hands the box to the girl, who takes it with a suspicious look. The young man says he will leave as soon as she feels better and asks her to use the item soon. She then opens the box and uses an inhaler, letting out a sigh of relief shortly after. The blacksmith's eyes widen in astonishment when he realizes what the mage has just used. Confused, Louise asks what his problem is, since he told her to get treatment, but now he's staring. The young man says that what she just did is only destroying her own throat. The screen reveals that the inhaler is releasing a bizarre and dangerous green energy into the air. The girl stares at him, astonished, asking what he means about the medicine. Louise frowns suspiciously and tells the young man to repeat what he just said. The hero remains calm and repeats the statement without any fear of the girl's threat. Just then, the hospital's loudspeaker calls for Cadet Lee Si-hoon, asking him to come to the front desk. The announcement is heard again, and the blacksmith realizes it's time to go, leaving the mage alone. Before leaving, he tells her to stop using that if she doesn't want to be crippled forever. Louise gets angry, calling him a jerk, and yells at him to get out of her room immediately. The blacksmith shrugs, ignoring the girl's insults, and calmly walks to the door. The mage is left alone, sitting on the bed in front of the window, cursing him for meddling. But at that moment, a notification appears, confirming that a bond has been formed with Louise Valent. The protagonist smiles as he walks down the hallway, happy to have successfully created the bond. In the doctor's office, the doctor informs him that the young man's fracture was clean, and his bones will heal. However, he recommends that the young man rest for another week, just to be safe, leaving him disappointed. The hero nods, thinking that in 2 weeks, he will need to get closer. Most importantly, he needs to deal with the problem of the inhaler, which acts like a poison. So the hero asks the doctor if he happens to know Louise, and the man says he treats her. The young man explains that he saw the girl try to use magic earlier, and then fate. He reveals that the young woman asked him to keep it a secret, but the situation seemed too dangerous to ignore. With the confession, the doctor understands the gravity of the situation and dismisses him while the blacksmith smiles. The next morning, the sun shines into the hospital room, illuminating the bed where the blacksmith is. The young man then picks up his phone and makes a direct call to the spear hair. His friend answers, half asleep, and the young man gets straight to the point, asking about the investigation. The blonde says he found some very suspicious details in the case and asks, if he knows of the Ivory Tower. He explains that the tower is an independent foundation run by mages and has a lot of influence. And because they choose scholarship recipients every year, the veteran necromancer was also aiming for it. The hero smiles at the information and easily concludes that the other major candidate was Luis. The blonde confirms, saying that the mage's weapon exploded and the opponent's family is a business partner. With this, it becomes clear that the two families acted together to attack the girl and his friend. The blacksmith listens attentively and asks if the amateur detective has discovered anything else. Reading the reports, the blonde young man says that Professor Charles decided to help the young woman. The protagonist finds this mentor's story very fishy and just thanks his partner. But before hanging up, his colleague warns that some people from the academy are worried. The hero quickly hangs up and sees messages from the redhead on his phone, confirming that everyone is concerned. Walking down the hospital corridor, he remembers that he doesn't even have the swordswoman's number. The young man decides to put that worry aside and knocks gently on the room door. A tired voice sounds from inside, and the blacksmith replies that it's the kind young man who helped her. But before he can finish his sentence, the door flies open violently, and a hand pulls him inside. The gray-haired mage pins him forcefully against the wall, showing she is furious with the blacksmith. With pure hatred in her eyes, she starts calling the protagonist every name in the book. The girl's furious scream echoes so loudly that it even scares the birds outside. The young man asks the reason for such sudden anger, and she retorts, screaming that he has no right to ask. She remembers the doctor warning that her training was too strenuous and that she would be bedridden. The young woman cries in anger, stating that all her 6 months of effort have been thrown down the drain. The blacksmith mentions the bizarre inhaler from the day before, and she crosses her arms, saying she hasn't used it. With a slight smile, the young man is happy with the news and assures her he will cure her illness. The mage laughs mockingly and says the illness is fatal, and not even the greatest mages in the world can cure it. But still, she crosses her arms, curious to hear what big lie he will tell next. The blacksmith just ignores the patient's suspicion and opens the drawer to get the inhaler. He holds up the black object and asks who recommended it, and the girl states she received it as a gift. The hero claims not to know the clinical name for that bizarre thing, but reveals that he calls it a mana jam. Louise is very confused, and the blacksmith quickly activates a vision ability to show her. He uses a simple old analogy, asking her to think of a wire designed to handle 100 volts being forced to carry 1,000. The mage's beautiful blue eyes widen as she pays close attention to every word of the explanation. The blacksmith shows his glowing neck and explains that in her case, her injured throat is the overloaded wire. This strong tension in the torn pathways generates terrible collisions that overload the system. The girl brings a hand to her throat in shock, realizing that the blacksmith's theory makes a lot of sense. He concludes that the supposed miracle cure actually worsens the situation and makes recovery impossible. A sad memory floods the girl's mind, remembering the moment the Wick professor gave her the item. Seeing the young woman tremble with pure fear, the young man gently touches her shoulder, calling her attention. The hero states that she can overcome the pain, just as the disguised villain pretended to care. The memory of her only mentor's false protective smile hurts her deeply, bringing immense pain. Louise clenches her trembling hands, finally understanding that the man she trusted most was betraying her. The patient grits her teeth with resentment, vowing to get revenge on that wicked professor without mercy. The blacksmith smiles upon seeing the fire of determination in the mage's eyes and confesses that he's not a healer. Therefore, he cannot heal her severe injury but promises to adjust everything so she can use her magic again. Not trusting him much, Lise is suspicious of the young man's intentions, doubting that he is helping for free. The young man looks at her calmly and says with a small smile that he wants very little in return. He reveals his plan to explore the 6 great demonic realms and invites her to join him. The mage hesitates at the surprising proposal, thinking about the great challenge while he just waits. The silver-haired girl gives a small smile amused by the protagonist's confidence. Finally accepting the risk, Louise extends her hand to him, warning him not to back out. The young man takes the girl's hand, smiling, and tells her not to retreat or give up either. A short time later, the hero returns from the store, holding up a full bag and smiling confidently. The patient is confused to see several cherries in the bag and asks if the training will be a picnic. The blacksmith ignores the joke and sits down, asking them to first review the state of her vocal cords. The young man begins to explain about the mana circuit, refined by the body for spells, and the solution he found is bizarre, consisting of refining all that energy in the tongue. Louise panics, finding the idea absurd, but the blacksmith points to a diagram on a board. The protagonist firmly admits that for anyone else, this would be impossible, but he points to her and smiles, saying with certainty that she would be able to do it. The girl remembers that this is the bizarre technique that made her world renowned as a motor mouth. Although frightened by the idea, the girl gives in and crosses her arms, asking him to explain. The young man picks up the first cherry, teaching her step number 1 to better control her power. He chews the fruit, explaining that the first step is to learn to master the control of power. Next, he shows a small tied stem and explains that the trick is coordination. Using her teeth and tongue, the patient learns that she must tie the stem with precise control. Desperately, she tries to use her teeth while he smiles, thinking he heard she was a genius. The young woman can't get the trick right and becomes enraged, starting to scream non-stop at her instructor, but he calmly praises her great effort, explaining that this is the next step. Upon entering the room, the doctor catches the girl reciting tongue twisters rapidly in training. Soon, he asks her to practice her speech by biting on a small piece of wood without making a mistake. After a long, intense week, Louise smiles, showing the tied stem with great joy. The young man praises her, and she becomes very smug, stating that something like this is very easy. The blacksmith finds it strange that she mastered it so quickly, but she already starts yelling in frustration. Tired, the patient doesn't understand how the voice training connects to her mana problem. Louise apologizes for her outburst, and the protagonist thinks she is stressed. Unfazed, he suggests trying a new bizarre shape with the stem to continue their progress. He then stops and explains that all this effort was to be able to refine the magic of enchantment. She is astonished, thinking that enchantment would be impossible without hands or a wand. The blacksmith decides to prove what he is capable of and announces that he will show how the process works. He focuses his mind, revealing that the secret to a strong enchantment is creating a vivid image. After gathering the energy, the young man converts it, shaping it into a perfect, glowing ball. Louise is shocked by the complexity, and the young man molds the ball, thinking about the right shape. Immediately, the mana sphere focuses, emitting a large and frightening flash in the hospital. The girl realizes he is using the power to accelerate the sphere, which soon becomes a beam. The energy grows, creating even more power surges, and a gigantic beam dominates the area, and in the blink of an eye, the hero fires the blast with force, grazing past and destroying the window. The power dissipates outside, showing a display of light blue lights in the sky. The mage looks astonished at the shattered window and the glow, and the young man gets nervous. He apologizes, blushing with embarrassment, and says he focused too much but promises to pay for it. But the girl just raises her hand in the air, asking for a moment with a serious expression on her face. She activates her blue mode, manifesting a great deal of power with pure mastery, just like he did. The blacksmith is very proud and watches her, feeling the immense power overflowing. The aura shines with a very strong blue light, and the young man praises the girl, noticing its size. The blacksmith smiles and explains that magic completely ignores the laws of the world they know. The silver-haired girl is startled to hear that a strong word ignores the laws of physics. At that moment, she touches her bandaged throat and realizes with surprise that the sharp pain is gone. With a confident smile, Louise finally understands the true feeling of using magic. Seeing the young woman's emotion, the young man says she can cry, but she refuses, stating she is not done yet. A look of pure vengeance appears as she promises to tear out the throat of the wretch who did this to her. The hero smiles, satisfied, and announces that they are now ready to finally move on to the next stage. The mage is very confused by his statement and asks what on earth this next stage is. He then shows his phone, revealing that the goal is to make her overcome her trauma for good. Meanwhile, at the ivory tower, the cadets are in the middle of an intense combat training session. Students fight desperately against a hooded enemy and wonder what this monster is. The skeleton glows with a yellow aura, and the students don't understand how it can be so strong. One of the students is thrown far away while a supervisor just watches everything with a bored expression. He cracks his neck and complains that there isn't a single useful freshman in that year's class. But an unexpected notification on his phone grabs the man's full attention. Annoyed, the man tells all the failures to get off the training field immediately. He then answers the phone and asks the person on the other end what is happening. On the other end of the line, a blond man named Goetz informs him that a challenge has been posted. His friend warns that the post is angering everyone and asks him to check the message. After reading the post, the supervisor becomes enraged and punches the wall with force, cursing the author. On his phone, he sees that the post was made by Cadet Louis Valent, who was on medical leave. Several students gather to read the post, where the girl challenges Cadet Goetz. Back at the hospital, the duo looks at the phone where the challenge with the date is set for a duel. Upon reading the final taunt in the message, the so-called Goetz crushes his phone in his hands with rage. In a dark room, the man swears he will crush the girl so that she can never use magic again. In the hospital room, Louise calls her new friend crazy for posting that challenge. The blacksmith calmly replies that it's not, as if he posted a major threat. The girl panics, saying that her enchantment magic is still at a baby level. Suspicious, she asks if this idea came from that Pierre guy, but the young man asks her to trust him. He explains that because of the incident, she is very afraid to use her magic freely. That's why the duel is absolutely necessary for her to overcome her trauma, even if it's forced. But the patient questions if her trauma won't worsen if she ends up losing the duel. The young man holds her hand firmly and tells her to stop talking such nonsense. With confidence, he states that there is no way she can lose to a guy like that while he is on her side. The protagonist reveals that he has already prepared the materials for her special weapon, using a unique method. The mage's eyes widen, completely surprised by this unexpected revelation. Feeling more confident, she smiles and excitedly asks what the next training will be. He simply replies that the next step will be an exam, leaving the girl even more confused. Next, the young man slowly starts putting on a black glove, preparing himself for the task. The hero then specifies that it will be an oral exam, leaving the young woman completely baffled. The mage's head spins, and she can only think about how bizarre this situation is. Elsewhere, two students are talking, and one finds it strange that a weapon would explode before a duel. His friend raises the suspicion of a conspiracy, as Louis would have been the scholarship recipient, if not for the incident. From a balcony above, Goetz overhears the conversation and calls the boy a pathetic fool. He gets angry that they can't handle one girl and are still spreading false rumors. Shortly after, the man appears on the phone, apologizing to his older brother for the mess. His relative tells him to solve everything himself, as their intervention would only make things worse. Alone, Goetz resents his brothers for wanting him to fail so they can take control. Frustrated with the situation, a man approaches from behind and calls his name in a sly tone. He turns to see Pierre Barmouth greeting him sarcastically as his best friend. Goetz glares at Pierre angrily and asks if he came to tell everyone what they did. He shoves the blonde against the wall and tells the idiot to stop being silent and speak up. The blonde accuses him of changing the plan, saying they could have just had the girl expelled by order. But Pierre turns his face away and admits he has nothing to say because the mistake was entirely his. Goetz doesn't want apologies and demands that his accomplice present a solution for the problem. He threatens him, saying they will both be dragged out of the line of succession if they are exposed. With a confident smile on his face, the blonde tells his partner in crime not to worry. A red glint appears in his eye, and he assures him he has a sure way to get rid of her for good.